This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter, Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 19. Poor Adam. When Una got home, Faith was lying face downwards on her bed, utterly refusing to be comforted. Aunt Martha had killed Adam. He was reposing on a platter in the pantry that very minute, trussed and dressed, encircled by his liver and heart and gizzard. Aunt Martha heeded Faith's passion of grief and anger not a whit. "We had to have something for the strange minister's dinner," she said. "You're too big a girl to make such a fuss over an old rooster. You knew he'd have to be killed sometime." "I'll tell father when he comes home what you've done," sobbed Faith. "Don't you go bothering your poor father. He has troubles enough, and I'm housekeeper here." "Adam was mine! Mrs. Johnson gave him to me. You had no business to touch him," stormed Faith. "Don't you get sassy now. The rooster's killed, and there's an end of it. I ain't going to set no strange minister down to a dinner of cold, boiled mutton. I was brought up to know better than that, if I have come down in the world." Faith would not go down to supper that night, and she would not go to church the next morning. But at dinner time she went to the table, her eyes swollen with crying, her face sullen. The Reverend James Perry was a sleek, rubicund man, with a bristling white mustache, bushy white eyebrows, and a shining bald head. He was certainly not handsome, and he was a very tiresome, pompous sort of person. But if he had looked like the Archangel Michael and talked with the tongues of men and angels, Faith would still have utterly detested him. He carved Adam up dexterously, showing off his plump white hands and a very handsome diamond ring. Also, he made jovial remarks all through the performance. Jerry and Carl giggled, and even Una smiled wanly, because she thought politeness demanded it, but Faith only scowled darkly. The Reverend James thought her manners shockingly bad. Once, when he was delivering himself of an unctuous remark to Jerry, Faith broke in rudely with a flat contradiction. The Reverend James drew his bushy eyebrows together at her. "Little girls should not interrupt," he said, "and they should not contradict people who know far more than they do." This put Faith in a worse temper than ever. To be called "little girl," as if she were no bigger than chubby Rilla Blythe over at Ingleside. It was insufferable. And how that abominable Mr. Perry did eat! He even picked poor Adam's bones. Neither Faith nor Una would touch a mouthful, and looked upon the boys as little better than cannibals. Faith felt that if that awful repast did not soon come to an end, she would wind up by throwing something at Mr. Perry's gleaming head. Fortunately, Mr. Perry found Aunt Martha's leathery apple pie too much even for his powers of mastication, and the meal came to an end, after a long grace, in which Mr. Perry offered up devout thanks for the food which a kind and beneficent Providence had provided for sustenance and temperate pleasure. "God hadn't a single thing to do with providing Adam for you," muttered Faith rebelliously under her breath. The boys gladly made their escape to outdoors. Una went to help Aunt Martha with the dishes, though that rather grumpy old dame never welcomed her timid assistance, and Faith betook herself to the study, where a cheerful wood fire was burning in the grate. She thought she would thereby escape from the hated Mr. Perry, who had announced his intention of taking a nap in his room during the afternoon. But scarcely had Faith settled herself in a corner with a book, when he walked in, and standing before the fire, proceeded to survey the disorderly study with an air of disapproval. "Your father's books seem to be in somewhat deplorable confusion, my little girl," he said severely. Faith darkled in her corner, and said not a word. She would not talk to this creature. "You should try to put them in order," Mr. Perry went on, playing with his handsome watch chain, and smiling patronizingly on Faith. "You are quite old enough to attend to such duties. My little daughter at home is only 10, and she is already an excellent little housekeeper, and the greatest help and comfort to her mother. She was a very sweet child. I wish you had the privilege of her acquaintance. She could help you in many ways. Of course, you have not had the inestimable privilege of a good mother's care and training. A sad lack, a very sad lack. I have spoken more than once to your father in this connection, and pointed out his duty to him faithfully, but so far with no effect. I trust he may awaken to a realization of his responsibility before it is too late. In the meantime, it is your duty and privilege to endeavour to take your sainted mother's place. You might exercise a great influence over your brothers and your little sister. You might be a true mother to them. I fear that you do not think of these things as you should. My dear child, allow me to open your eyes in regard to them." Mr. Perry's oily, complacent voice trickled on. He was in his element. Nothing suited him better than to lay down the law, patronize, and exhort. He had no idea of stopping, and he did not stop. He stood before the fire, his feet planted firmly on the rug, and poured out a flood of pompous platitudes. Faith heard not a word. She was really not listening to him at all, but she was watching his long black coat-tails with impish delight growing in her brown eyes. Mr. Perry was standing very near the fire. His coat-tails began to scorch. His coat-tails began to smoke. He still prosed on, wrapped up in his own eloquence. The coat-tails smoked worse. A tiny spark flew up from the burning wood and alighted in the middle of one. It clung and caught and spread into a smouldering flame. Faith could restrain herself no longer, and broke into a stifled giggle. Mr. Perry stopped short, angered over this impertinence. Suddenly he became conscious that a reek of burning cloth filled the room. He whirled round and saw nothing. Then he clapped his hands to his coat-tails and brought them around in front of him. There was already quite a hole in one of them, and this was his new suit. Faith shook with helpless laughter over his pose and expression. "Did you see my coat-tails burning?" he demanded angrily. "Yes, sir," said Faith demurely. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded, glaring at her. "You said it wasn't good manners to interrupt, sir," said Faith, more demurely still. If I was your father, I would give you a spanking that you would remember all your life, miss," said a very angry reverend gentleman, as he stalked out of the study. The coat of Mr. Meredith's second-best suit would not fit Mr. Perry, so he had to go to the evening service with his singed coat-tail. But he did not walk up the aisle with his usual consciousness of the honour he was conferring on the building. He never would agree to an exchange of pulpits with Mr. Meredith again, and he was barely civil to the latter when they met for a few minutes at the station the next morning. But Faith felt a certain gloomy satisfaction. Adam was partially avenged. End of chapter 19. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter, Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 20. Faith Makes a Friend. Next day in school was a hard one for Faith. Mary Vance had told the tale of Adam, and all the scholars, except for the Blythes, thought it quite a joke. The girls told Faith, between giggles, that it was too bad, and the boys wrote sardonic notes of condolence to her. Poor Faith went home from school, feeling her very soul raw and smarting within her. "I'm going over to Ingleside to have a talk with Mrs. Blythe," she sobbed. "She won't laugh at me, as everybody else does. I've just got to talk to somebody who understands how bad I feel." She ran down through Rainbow Valley. Enchantment had been at work the night before. A light snow had fallen, and the powdered firs were dreaming of a spring to come and a joy to be. The long hill beyond was richly purple with leafless beeches. The rosy light of sunset lay over the world like a pink kiss. Of all the airy fairy places, full of weird elfin grace, Rainbow Valley that winter evening was the most beautiful. But all its dreamlike loveliness was lost on poor, sore-hearted little Faith. By the brook she came suddenly upon Rosemary West, who was sitting on the old pine tree. She was on her way home from Ingleside, where she had been giving the girls their music lesson. She had been lingering in Rainbow Valley quite a little time, looking across its white beauty and roaming some byways of dream. Judging from the expression on her face, her thoughts were pleasant ones. Perhaps the faint, occasional tinkle from the bells on the Tree Lovers brought the little lurking smile to her lips. Or perhaps it was occasioned by the consciousness that John Meredith seldom failed to spend Monday evening in the grey house on the white, wind-swept hill. Into Rosemary's dreams burst Faith Meredith, full of rebellious bitterness. Faith stopped abruptly when she saw Miss West. She did not know her very well, just well enough to speak to when they met, and she did not want to see anyone just then, except Mrs. Blythe. She knew her eyes and nose were red and swollen, and she hated to have a stranger know she had been crying. "Good evening, Miss West," she said uncomfortably. "What is the matter, Faith?" asked Rosemary gently. "Nothing," said Faith rather shortly. "Oh," Rosemary smiled. "You mean nothing that you can tell to outsiders, don't you?" Faith looked at Miss West with sudden interest. Here was a person who understood things. And how pretty she was! How golden her hair was under her plumy hat! How pink her cheeks were over her velvet coat! How blue and companionable her eyes were! Faith felt that Miss West could be a lovely friend, if only she were a friend instead of a stranger. I'm going up to tell Mrs. Blythe," said Faith. "She always understands. She never laughs at us. I always talk things over with her. It helps." "Dear girlie, I'm sorry to have to tell you that Mrs. Blythe isn't home," said Miss West sympathetically. "She went to Avonlea today, and isn't coming back till the last of the week." Faith's lip quivered. "Then I might as well go home again," she said miserably. "I suppose so, unless you think you could bring yourself to talk it over with me instead," said Miss Rosemary gently. "It is such a help to talk things over. I know. I don't suppose I can be as good at understanding as Mrs. Blythe, but I promise you that I won't laugh." "You wouldn't laugh outside," hesitated Faith, "but you might inside." "No, I wouldn't laugh inside either. Why should I? Something has hurt you. It never amuses me to see anybody hurt, no matter what hurts them. If you feel that you'd like to tell me what has hurt you, I'll be glad to listen. But if you think you'd rather not, that's all right too, dear." Faith took another long, earnest look into Miss West's eyes. They were very serious. There was no laughter in them, not even far, far back. With a little sigh, she sat down on the old pine beside her new friend and told her all about Adam and his cruel fate. Rosemary did not laugh, or feel like laughing. She understood and sympathized. Really, she was almost as good as Mrs. Blythe. Yes, quite as good. "Mr. Perry is a minister, but he should have been a butcher," said Faith bitterly. "He is so fond of carving things up. He enjoyed cutting poor Adam to pieces. He just sliced into him as if he were any common rooster." "Between you and me, Faith, I don't like Mr. Perry very well myself," said Rosemary, laughing a little, but at Mr. Perry, not at Adam, as Faith clearly understood. "I never did like him. I went to school with him. He was a Glen boy, you know, and he was a most detestable little prig even then. Oh, how we girls used to hate holding his fat, clammy hands in the ring-around games. But we must remember, dear, that he didn't know that Adam had been a pet of yours. He thought he was just a common rooster. We must be just, even when we are terribly hurt." "I suppose so," admitted Faith. "But why does everybody seem to think it funny that I should have loved Adam so much, Miss West? If it had been a horrid old cat, nobody would have thought it queer. When Lottie Warren's kitten had its legs cut off by the binder, everybody was sorry for her. She cried 2 days in school, and nobody laughed at her, not even Dan Reese. And all her chums went to the kitten's funeral and helped her bury it, only they couldn't bury its poor little paws with it because they couldn't find them. It was a horrid thing to have happen, of course, but I don't think it was as dreadful as seeing your pet eaten up. Yet everybody laughs at me." "I think it is because the name Rooster seems rather a funny one," said Rosemary gravely. "There is something in it that is comical. Now Chicken is different. It doesn't sound so funny to talk of loving a chicken." "Adam was the dearest little chicken, Miss West. He was just a little golden ball. He would run up to me and peck out of my hand. And he was handsome when he grew up, too, white as snow, with such a beautiful curving white tail, though Mary Vance said it was too short. He knew his name and always came when I called him. He was a very intelligent rooster, and Aunt Martha had no right to kill him. He was mine. It wasn't fair, was it, Miss West?" "No, it wasn't," said Rosemary decidedly. "Not a bit fair. I remember I had a pet hen when I was a little girl. She was such a pretty little thing, all golden brown and speckly. I loved her as much as I ever loved any pet. She was never killed. She died of old age. Mother wouldn't have her killed because she was my pet." "If my mother had been living, she wouldn't have let Adam be killed," said Faith. "For that matter, Father wouldn't have either, if he'd been home and known of it. I'm sure he wouldn't, Miss West." "I'm sure too," said Rosemary. There was a little added flush on her face. She looked rather conscious, but Faith noticed nothing. "Was it very wicked of me not to tell Mr. Perry his coat tails were scorching?" she asked anxiously. "Oh, terribly wicked," answered Rosemary with dancing eyes. "But I would have been just as naughty, Faith. I wouldn't have told him they were scorching. And I don't believe I would ever have been a bit sorry for my wickedness either. Una thought I should have told him because he was a minister. Dearest, if a minister doesn't behave as a gentleman, we are not bound to respect his coat tails. I know I would just have loved to see Jimmy Perry's coat tails burning up. It must have been fun." Both laughed, but Faith ended with a bitter little sigh. "Well, anyway, Adam is dead, and I am never going to love anything again." "Don't say that, dear. We miss so much out of life if we don't love. The more we love, the richer life is, even if it is only some little furry or feathery pet. Would you like a canary, Faith? A little golden bit of a canary? If you would, I'll give you one. We have 2 up home." "Oh, I would like that!" cried Faith. "I love birds. Only, would Aunt Martha's cat eat it? It's so tragic to have your pets eaten. I don't think I could endure it a second time." "If you hang the cage far enough from the wall, I don't think the cat could harm it. I'll tell you just how to take care of it, and I'll bring it to Ingleside for you the next time I come down." To herself, Rosemary was thinking, "It will give every gossip in the glen something to talk of, but I will not care. I want to comfort this poor little heart." Faith was comforted. Sympathy and understanding were very sweet. She and Rosemary sat on the old pine until the twilight crept softly down over the white valley and the evening star shone over the gray maple grove. Faith told Rosemary all her small history and hopes, her likes and dislikes, the ins and outs of life at the manse, the ups and downs of school society. Finally they parted firm friends. Mr. Meredith was, as usual, lost in dreams when supper began that evening, but presently a name pierced his abstraction and brought him back to reality. Faith was telling Una of her meeting with Rosemary. "She is just lovely, I think," said Faith. "Just as nice as Mrs. Blythe, but different. I felt as if I wanted to hug her. She did hug me, such a nice velvety hug, and she called me dearest. It thrilled me. I could tell her anything." "So you liked Miss West, Faith?" Mr. Meredith asked, with a rather odd intonation. "I love her!" cried Faith. "Ah!" said Mr. Meredith. "Ah!" End of chapter 20. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter. Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 21. The Impossible Word. John Meredith walked meditatively through the clear crispness of a winter night in Rainbow Valley. The hills beyond glistened with the chill, splendid luster of moonlight on snow. Every little fir tree in the long valley sang its own wild song to the harp of wind and frost. His children and the blithe lads and lasses were coasting down the eastern slope and whizzing over the glassy pond. They were having a glorious time, and their gay voices and gayer laughter echoed up and down the valley, dying away in elfin cadences among the trees. On the right the lights of Ingleside gleamed through the maple grove with the genial lure and invitation which seems always to glow in the beacons of a home where we know there is love and good cheer and a welcome for all kin, whether of flesh or spirit. Mr. Meredith liked very well on occasion to spend an evening arguing with the doctor by the driftwood fire, where the famous china dogs of Ingleside kept ceaseless watch and ward, as became deities of the hearth, but tonight he did not look that way. Far on the western hill gleamed a paler but more alluring star. Mr. Meredith was on his way to see Rosemary West, and he meant to tell her something which had been slowly blossoming in his heart since their first meeting, and had sprung into full flower on the evening when Faith had so warmly voiced her admiration for Rosemary. He had come to realize that he had learned to care for Rosemary, not as he had cared for Cecilia, of course. That was entirely different. That love and romance and dream and glamour could never, he thought, return. But Rosemary was beautiful and sweet and dear, very dear. She was the best of companions. He was happier in her company than he had ever expected to be again. She would be an ideal mistress for his home, a good mother to his children. During his years of widowhood, Mr. Meredith had received innumerable hints from brother members of Presbytery, and from many parishioners who could not be suspected of any ulterior motive, as well as from some who could, that he ought to marry again. But these hints never made any impression on him. It was commonly thought he was never aware of them, but he was quite acutely aware of them, and in his own occasional visitations of common sense, he knew that the common, sensible thing for him to do was to marry. But common sense was not the strong point of John Meredith, and to choose out, deliberately and cold-bloodedly, some suitable woman, as one might choose a housekeeper or a business partner, was something he was quite incapable of doing. How he hated that word, suitable! It reminded him so strongly of James Parry. A suitable woman of suitable age, that unctuous brother of the cloth had said, in his far from subtle hint. For the moment John Meredith had had a perfectly unbelievable desire to rush madly away and propose marriage to the youngest, most unsuitable woman it was possible to discover. Mrs. Marshall Elliott was his good friend, and he liked her. But when she had bluntly told him he should marry again, he felt as if she had torn away the veil that hung before some sacred shrine of his innermost life, and he had been more or less afraid of her ever since. He knew there were women in his congregation of suitable age who would marry him quite readily. That fact had seeped through all his abstraction very early in his ministry at Glen St. Mary. They were good, substantial, uninteresting women, one or two fairly comely, the others not exactly so, and John Meredith would as soon have thought of marrying any one of them as of hanging himself. He had some ideals to which no seeming necessity could make him false. He could ask no woman to fill Cecilia's place in his home, unless he could offer her at least some of the affection and homage he had given to his girlish bride. And where, in his limited feminine acquaintance, was such a woman to be found? Rosemary West had come into his life on that autumn evening, bringing with her an atmosphere in which his spirit recognized native air. Across the gulf of strangerhood they clasped hands of friendship. He knew her better in that 10 minutes by the hidden spring than he knew Emmeline Drew or Elizabeth Kirk or Amy Annetta Douglas in a year, or could know them in a century. He had fled to her for comfort when Mrs. Alec Davis had outraged his mind and soul and had found it. Since then he had gone often to the house on the hill, slipping through the shadowy paths of night in Rainbow Valley so astutely that Glen gossip could never be absolutely certain that he did go to see Rosemary West. Once or twice he had been caught in the West living-room by other visitors. That was all the Ladies' Aid had to go by. But when Elizabeth Kirk heard it, she put away a secret hope she had allowed herself to cherish, without a change of expression on her kind, plain face, and Emmeline Drew resolved that the next time she saw a certain old bachelor of Lowbridge, she would not snub him as she had done at a previous meeting. Of course, if Rosemary West was out to catch the minister, she would catch him. She looked younger than she was, and men thought her pretty. Besides, the West girls had money. "It is to be hoped that he won't be so absent-minded as to propose to Ellen by mistake," was the only malicious thing she allowed herself to say to a sympathetic sister Drew. Emmeline bore no further grudge towards Rosemary. When all was said and done, an unencumbered bachelor was far better than a widower with 4 children. It had been only the glamour of the manse that had temporarily blinded Emmeline's eyes to the better part. A sled with 3 shrieking occupants sped past Mr. Meredith to the pond. Faith's long curls streamed in the wind, and her laughter rang above that of the others. John Meredith looked after them kindly and longingly. He was glad that his children had such chums as the Blythes, glad that they had so wise and gay and tender a friend as Mrs. Blythe. But they needed something more, and that something would be supplied when he brought Rosemary West as a bride to the old manse. There was in her a quality essentially maternal. It was Saturday night, and he did not often go calling on Saturday night, which was supposed to be dedicated to a thoughtful revision of Sunday's sermon. But he had chosen this night because he had learned that Ellen West was going to be away, and Rosemary would be alone. Often as he had spent pleasant evenings in the house on the hill, he had never, since that first meeting at the spring, seen Rosemary alone. Ellen had always been there. He did not precisely object to Ellen being there. He liked Ellen West very much, and they were the best of friends. Ellen had an almost masculine understanding, and a sense of humour which his own shy, hidden appreciation of fun found very agreeable. He liked her interest in politics and world events. There was no man in the Glen, not even excepting Dr. Blythe, who had a better grasp of such things. "I think it is just as well to be interested in things as long as you live," she had said. "If you're not, it doesn't seem to me that there's much difference between the quick and the dead." He liked her pleasant, deep, rumbly voice. He liked the hearty laugh with which she always ended up some jolly and well-told story. She never gave him digs about his children as other Glen women did. She never bored him with local gossip. She had no malice and no pettiness. She was always splendidly sincere. Mr. Meredith, who had picked up Miss Cornelia's way of classifying people, considered that Ellen belonged to the race of Joseph. Altogether an admirable woman for a sister-in-law. Nevertheless, a man did not want even the most admirable of women around when he was proposing to another woman. And Ellen was always around. She did not insist on talking to Mr. Meredith herself all the time. She let Rosemary have a fair share of him. Many evenings, indeed, Ellen effaced herself almost totally, sitting back in the corner with St. George in her lap, and letting Mr. Meredith and Rosemary talk and sing and read books together. Sometimes they quite forgot her presence. But if their conversation or choice of duets ever betrayed the least tendency to what Ellen considered philandering, Ellen promptly nipped that tendency in the bud and blotted Rosemary out for the rest of the evening. But not even the grimmest of amiable dragons can altogether prevent a certain subtle language of eye and smile and eloquent silence. And so the minister's courtship progressed after a fashion. But if it was ever to reach a climax, that climax must come when Ellen was away. And Ellen was so seldom away, especially in winter. She found her own fireside the pleasantest place in the world, she vowed. Gadding had no attraction for her. She was fond of company, but she wanted it at home. Mr. Meredith had almost been driven to the conclusion that he must write to Rosemary what he wanted to say, when Ellen casually announced one evening that she was going to a silver wedding next Saturday night. She had been bridesmaid when the principals were married. Only old guests were invited, so Rosemary was not included. Mr. Meredith pricked up his ears a trifle, and a gleam flashed into his dreamy dark eyes. Both Ellen and Rosemary saw it, and both Ellen and Rosemary felt, with a tingling shock, that Mr. Meredith would certainly come up the hill next Saturday night. "Might as well have it over with, St. George," Ellen sternly told the black cat, after Mr. Meredith had gone home and Rosemary had silently gone upstairs. "He means to ask her, St. George, I'm perfectly sure of that. So he might as well have his chance to do it and find out he can't get her, George. She'd rather like to take him, Saint." "I know that, but she promised, and she's got to keep her promise. I'm rather sorry in some ways, St. George. I don't know of a man I'd sooner have for a brother-in-law, if a brother-in-law was convenient. I haven't a thing against him, Saint, not a thing, except that he won't see and can't be made to see that the Kaiser is a menace to the peace of Europe. That's his blind spot. But he's good company, and I like him. A woman can say anything she likes to a man with a mouth like John Meredith's, and be sure of not being misunderstood. Such a man is more precious than rubies, Saint, and much rarer, George. But he can't have Rosemary, and I suppose when he finds out he can't have her, he'll drop us both, and we'll miss him, Saint. We'll miss him something scandalous, George. But she promised, and I'll see that she keeps her promise." Ellen's face looked almost ugly in his lowering resolution. Upstairs, Rosemary was crying into her pillow. So Mr. Meredith found his lady alone and looking very beautiful. Rosemary had not made any special toilette for the occasion. She wanted to, but she thought it would be absurd to dress up for a man you meant to refuse. So she wore her plain, dark afternoon dress, and looked like a queen in it. Her suppressed excitement colored her face to brilliancy. Her great blue eyes were pools of light less placid than usual. She wished the interview were over. She had looked forward to it all day with dread. She felt quite sure that John Meredith cared a great deal for her after a fashion, and she felt just as sure that he did not care for her as he had cared for his first love. She felt that her refusal would disappoint him considerably, but she did not think it would altogether overwhelm him. Yet she hated to make it, hated for his sake, and, Rosemary was quite honest with herself, for her own. She knew she could have loved John Meredith if it had been permissible. She knew that life would be a blank thing if, rejected as lover, he refused longer to be a friend. She knew that she could be very happy with him, and that she could make him happy. But between her and happiness stood the prison gate of the promise she had made to Ellen years ago. Rosemary could not remember her father. He had died when she was only 3 years old. Ellen, who had been 13, remembered him, but with no special tenderness. He had been a stern, reserved man, many years older than his fair, pretty wife. 5 years later, their brother of 12 died also. Since his death, the two girls had always lived alone with their mother. They had never mingled very freely in the social life of the Glen or Lowbridge, though where they went the wit and spirit of Ellen, and sweetness and beauty of Rosemary, made them welcome guests. Both had what was called a disappointment in their girlhood. The sea had not given up Rosemary's lover, and Norman Douglas, then a handsome red-haired young giant, noted for wild driving and noisy through harmless escapades, had quarrelled with Ellen, and left her in a fit of pique. There were not lacking candidates for both Martin's and Norman's places, but none seemed to find favour in the eyes of the West girls, who drifted slowly out of youth and bellehood without any seeming regret. They were devoted to their mother, who was a chronic invalid. The three had a little circle of home interests, books and pets and flowers, which made them happy and contented. Mrs. West's death, which occurred on Rosemary's 25th birthday, was a bitter grief to them. At first they were intolerably lonely. Ellen especially continued to grieve and brood, her long, moody musings broken only by fits of stormy, passionate weeping. The old Lowbridge doctor told Rosemary that he feared permanent melancholy, or worse. Once, when Ellen had sat all day, refusing either to speak or eat, Rosemary had flung herself on her knees by her sister's side. "Oh, Ellen, you have me yet," she said imploringly. "Am I nothing to you? We have always loved each other so." "I won't have you always," Ellen had said, breaking her silence with harsh intensity. "You will marry and leave me. I shall be left all alone. I cannot bear the thought. I cannot. I would rather die." "I will never marry," said Rosemary. "Never, Ellen." Ellen bent forward and looked searchingly into Rosemary's eyes. "Will you promise me that solemnly?" she said. "Promise it on Mother's Bible." Rosemary assented at once, quite willingly to humour Ellen. What did it matter? She knew quite well she would never want to marry anyone. Her love had gone down with Martin Crawford to the deeps of the sea, and without love she could not marry anyone. So she promised readily, though Ellen made rather a fearsome rite of it. They clasped hands over the Bible in their mother's vacant room, and both vowed to each other that they would never marry and would always live together. Ellen's condition improved from that hour. She soon regained her normal cheery poise. For 10 years she and Rosemary lived in the old house happily, undisturbed by any thought of marrying or giving in marriage. Their promise sat very lightly on them. Ellen never failed to remind her sister of it whenever any eligible male creature crossed their paths, but she had never been really alarmed until John Meredith came home that night with Rosemary. As for Rosemary, Ellen's obsession regarding that promise had always been a little matter of mirth to her, until lately. Now it was a merciless fetter, self-imposed, but never to be shaken off. Because of it tonight she must turn her face from happiness. It was true that the shy, sweet, rosebud love she had given to her boy lover she could never give to another. But she knew now that she could give to John Meredith a love richer and more womanly. She knew that he touched deeps in her nature that Martin had never touched, that had not, perhaps, been in the girl of 17 to touch. And she must send him away tonight, send him back to his lonely hearth and his empty life and his heart-breaking problems, because she had promised Ellen 10 years before, on their mother's Bible, that she would never marry. John Meredith did not immediately grasp his opportunity. On the contrary, he talked for 2 good hours on the least lover-like of subjects. He even tried politics, though politics always bored Rosemary. The latter began to think that she had been altogether mistaken, and her fears and expectations suddenly seemed to her grotesque. She felt flat and foolish. The glow went out of her face, and the lustre out of her eyes. John Meredith had not the slightest intention of asking her to marry him. And then, quite suddenly, he rose, came across the room, and standing by her chair, he asked it. The room had grown terribly still. Even St. George ceased to purr. Rosemary heard her own heart beating, and was sure John Meredith must hear it too. Now was the time for her to say no, gently but firmly. She had been ready for days with her stilted, regretful little formula, and now the words of it had completely vanished from her mind. She had to say no, and she suddenly found she could not say it. It was the impossible word. She knew now that it was not that she could have loved John Meredith, but that she did love him. The thought of putting him from her life was agony. She must say something. She lifted her bowed golden head, and asked him stammeringly to give her a few days for consideration. John Meredith was a little surprised. He was not vainer than any man has a right to be, but he had expected that Rosemary West would say yes. He had been tolerably sure she cared for him. Then why this doubt, this hesitation? She was not a schoolgirl to be uncertain as to her own mind. He felt an ugly shock of disappointment and dismay. But he assented to her request with his unfailing courtesy, and went away at once. "I will tell you in a few days," said Rosemary, with downward eyes and burning face. When the door shut behind him, she went back into the room and wrung her hands. End of chapter 21. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter, Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 22. St. George knows all about it. At midnight, Ellen West was walking home from the Pollock silver wedding. She had stayed a little while after the other guests had gone, to help the gray-haired bride wash the dishes. The distance between the two houses was not far and the road good, so that Ellen was enjoying her walk back home in the moonlight. The evening had been a pleasant one. Ellen, who had not been to a party for years, found it very pleasant. All the guests had been members of her old set, and there was no intrusive youth to spoil the flavor, for the only son of the bride and groom was far away at college and could not be present. Norman Douglas had been there, and they had met socially for the first time in years, though she had seen him once or twice in church that winter. Not the least sentiment was awakened in Ellen's heart by their meeting. She was accustomed to wonder, when she thought about it at all, how she could ever have fancied him, or felt so badly over his sudden marriage. But she had rather liked meeting him again. She had forgotten how bracing and stimulating he could be. No gathering was ever stagnant when Norman Douglas was present. Everybody had been surprised when Norman came. It was well known he never went anywhere. The Pollocks had invited him because he had been one of the original guests, but they never thought he would come. He had taken his second cousin, Amy Annetta Douglas, out to supper, and seemed rather attentive to her. But Ellen sat across the table from him, and had a spirited argument with him, an argument during which all his shouting and banter could not fluster her, and in which she came off best, flooring Norman so composedly and so completely that he was silent for 10 minutes. At the end of which time he had muttered in his ruddy beard, "Spunky as ever, spunky as ever," and began to hector Amy Annetta, who giggled foolishly over his sallies, where Ellen would have retorted bitingly. Ellen thought these things over as she walked home, tasting them with reminiscent relish. The moonlit air sparkled with frost. The snow crisped under her feet. Below her lay the glen, with the white harbour beyond. There was a light in the manse study. So John Meredith had gone home. Had he asked Rosemary to marry him? And after what fashion had she made her refusal known? Ellen felt that she would never know this, though she was quite curious. She was sure Rosemary would never tell her anything about it, and she would not dare to ask. She must just be content with the fact of the refusal. After all, that was the only thing that really mattered. "I hope he'll have sense enough to come back once in a while and be friendly," she said to herself. She disliked so much to be alone that thinking aloud was one of her devices for circumventing unwelcome solitude. It's awful never to have a man-body with some brains to talk to once in a while. And like as not, he'll never come near the house again. There's Norman Douglas, too. I like that man, and I'd like to have a good rousing argument with him now and then, but he'd never dare come up, for fear people would think he was courting me again. For fear I'd think it too, most likely, though he's more a stranger to me now than John Meredith. It seems like a dream that we could ever have been beaux. But there it is. There's only 2 men in the glen I'd ever want to talk to, and what with gossip and this wretched love-making business, it's not likely I'll ever see either of them again. "I could," said Ellen, addressing the unmoved stars with a spiteful emphasis, "I could have made a better world myself." She paused at her gate, with a sudden vague feeling of alarm. There was still a light in the living-room, and to and fro across the window-shades went the shadow of a woman, walking restlessly up and down. What was Rosemary doing up at this hour of the night, and why was she striding about like a lunatic? Ellen went softly in. As she opened the hall door, Rosemary came out of the room. She was flushed and breathless. An atmosphere of stress and passion hung about her like a garment. "Why aren't you in bed, Rosemary?" demanded Ellen. "Come in here," said Rosemary intensely. "I want to tell you something." Ellen composedly removed her wraps and overshoes, and followed her sister into the warm, fire-lighted room. She stood with her hand on the table and waited. She was looking very handsome herself, in her own grim, black-browed style. The new black velvet dress, with its train and V-neck, which she had made purposely for the party, became her stately, massive figure. She wore coiled around her neck the rich, heavy necklace of amber beads which was a family heirloom. Her walk in the frosty air had stung her cheeks into a glowing scarlet, but her steel-blue eyes were as icy and unyielding as the sky of the winter night. She stood waiting in a silence which Rosemary could break only by a convulsive effort. "Ellen, Mr. Meredith was here this evening." "Yes." "And he asked me to marry him." "So I expected. Of course, you refused him." "No." "Rosemary!" Ellen clenched her hands and took an involuntary step forward. "Do you mean to tell me that you accepted him?" "No, no." Ellen recovered her self-command. "What did you do, then?" I asked him to give me a few days to think it over." "I hardly see why that was necessary," said Ellen, coldly contemptuous, "when there is only the one answer you can make him." Rosemary held out her hands beseechingly. "Ellen," she said desperately, "I love John Meredith. I want to be his wife. Will you set me free from that promise?" "No," said Ellen, merciless, because she was sick from fear. "Ellen, Ellen—" "Listen," interrupted Ellen. "I did not ask you for that promise. You offered it." "I know, but I did not think then that I could ever care for anyone again." "You offered it," went on Ellen unmovably. "You promised it, over our mother's Bible. It was more than a promise, it was an oath. Now you want to break it." "I only asked you to set me free from it, Ellen." "I will not do it. A promise is a promise in my eyes. I will not do it. Break your promise. Be forsworn if you will, but it shall not be with any assent of mine." "You are very hard on me, Ellen." "Hard on you! And what of me? Have you ever given a thought to what my loneliness would be here if you left me? I could not bear it. I would go crazy. I cannot live alone. Haven't I been a good sister to you? Have I ever opposed any wish of yours? Haven't I indulged you in everything?" "Yes, yes." "Then why do you want to leave me for this man whom you hadn't seen a year ago?" "I love him, Ellen." "Love! You talk like a schoolmiss instead of a middle-aged woman. He doesn't love you. He wants a housekeeper and a governess. You don't love him. You want to be Mrs. You are one of those weak-minded women who thinks it's a disgrace to be ranked as an old maid. That's all there is to it." Rosemary quivered. Ellen could not or would not understand. There was no use arguing with her. "So you won't release me, Ellen?" "No, I won't. And I won't talk of it again. You promised, and you've got to keep your word. That's all. Go to bed. Look at the time. You're all romantic and worked up. Tomorrow you'll be more sensible. At any rate, don't let me hear any more of this nonsense. Go." Rosemary went without another word, pale and spiritless. Ellen walked stormily about the room for a few minutes, then paused before the chair where St. George had been calmly sleeping through the whole evening. A reluctant smile overspread her dark face. There had been only one time in her life, the time of her mother's death, when Ellen had not been able to temper tragedy with comedy. Even in that long-ago bitterness, when Norman Douglas had, after a fashion, jilted her, she had laughed at herself quite as often as she had cried. "I expect there'll be some sulking, St. George. Yes, Saint, I expect we are in for a few unpleasant foggy days. Well, we'll weather through them, George. We've dealt with foolish children before, Saint. Rosemary'll sulk a while, and then she'll get over it, and all will be as before, George. She promised, and she's got to keep her promise. And that's the last word on the subject I'll say to you or her or anyone, Saint." But Ellen lay savagely awake till morning. There was no sulking, however. Rosemary was pale and quiet the next day, but beyond that Ellen could detect no difference in her. Certainly she seemed to bear Ellen no grudge. It was stormy, so no mention was made of going to church. In the afternoon Rosemary shut herself in her room and wrote a note to John Meredith. She could not trust herself to say no in person. She felt quite sure that if he suspected she was saying no reluctantly, he would not take it for an answer, and she could not face pleading or entreaty. She must make him think she cared nothing at all for him, and she could do that only by letter. She wrote him the stiffest, coolest little refusal imaginable. It is barely courteous. It certainly left no loophole of hope for the boldest lover, and John Meredith was anything but that. He shrank into himself, hurt and mortified, when he read Rosemary's letter next day in his dusty study. But under his mortification a dreadful realization presently made itself felt. He had thought he did not love Rosemary as deeply as he had loved Cecilia. Now, when he had lost her, he knew that he did. She was everything to him, everything, and he must put her out of his life completely. Even friendship was impossible now. Life stretched before him in intolerable dreariness. He must go on. There was his work, his children, but the heart had gone out of him. He sat alone all that evening in his dark, cold, comfortless study, with his head bowed on his hands. Up on the hill Rosemary had a headache, and went early to bed, while Ellen remarked to St. George, purring his disdain of foolish humankind, who did not know that a soft cushion was the only thing that really mattered. "What would women do if headaches had never been invented, St. George? But never mind, Saint. We'll just wink the other eye for a few weeks. I admit I don't feel comfortable myself, George. I feel as if I had drowned a kitten, but she promised, Saint, and she was the one to offer it, George. Bismillah." End of chapter 22. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter. Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 23. The Good Conduct Club. A light rain had been falling all day, a little, delicate, beautiful spring rain, that somehow seemed to hint and whisper of mayflowers and wakening violets. The harbour and the gulf and the low-lying shore-fields had been dim with pearl-grey mists. But now in the evening the rain had ceased and the mists had blown out to sea. Clouds sprinkled the sky over the harbour like little fiery roses. Beyond it the hills were dark against a spendthrift splendour of daffodil and crimson. A great silvery evening star was watching over the bar. A brisk, dancing, new-sprung wind was blowing up from Rainbow Valley, resinous with the odours of fir and damp mosses. It crooned in the old spruces around the graveyard, and ruffled Faith's splendid curls as she sat on Hezekiah Pollock's tombstone with her arms round Mary Vance and Una. Carl and Jerry were sitting opposite them on another tombstone, and all were rather full of mischief after being cooped up all day. "The air just shines tonight, doesn't it? It's been washed so clean, you see," said Faith happily. Mary Vance eyed her gloomily. Knowing what she knew, or fancied she knew, Mary considered that Faith was far too light-hearted. Mary had something on her mind to say, and she meant to say it before she went home. Mrs. Elliott had sent her up to the manse with some new-laid eggs, and had told her not to stay longer than half an hour. The half-hour was nearly up, so Mary uncurled her cramped legs from under her, and said abruptly, "Never mind about the air. Just you listen to me. You manse young ones have just got to behave yourselves better than you've been doing this spring. That's all there is to it. I just come up tonight a purpose to tell you so. The way people are talking about you is awful." "What have we been doing now?" cried Faith in amazement, pulling her arm away from Mary. Una's lips trembled, and her sensitive little soul shrank within her. Mary was always so brutally frank. Jerry began to whistle out of bravado. He meant to let Mary see he didn't care for her tirades. Their behaviour was no business of hers, anyway. What right had she to lecture them on their conduct? "Doing now? You're doing all the time," retorted Mary. "Just as soon as the talk about one of your didos fades away, you do something else to start it up again. It seems to me you haven't any idea of how manse children ought to behave." "Maybe you can tell us," said Jerry, killingly sarcastic. Sarcasm was quite thrown away on Mary. "I can tell you what will happen if you don't learn to behave yourselves. The session will ask your father to resign. There now, Master Jerry Know-it-all. Mrs. Alec Davis said so to Mrs. Elliott. I heard her. I always have my ears pricked up when Mrs. Alec Davis comes to tea. She said you were all going from bad to worse, and that though it was only what was to be expected when you had nobody to bring you up, still the congregation couldn't be expected to put up with it much longer, and something would have to be done. The Methodists just laugh and laugh at you, and that hurts the Presbyterian feelings. She says you all need a good dose of birch tonic. Lor, if that would make folks good, I ought to be a young saint. I'm not telling you this because I want to hurt your feelings. I'm sorry for you." Mary was past mistress of the gentle art of condescension. "I understand that you haven't much choice, the way things are. But other people don't make as much allowance as I do. Miss Drew says Carl had a frog in his pocket in Sunday school last Sunday, and it hopped out while she was hearing the lesson. She says she's going to give up the class. Why don't you keep your insects home?" "I popped it right back in again," cried Carl. "It didn't hurt anybody. A poor little frog. And I wish old Jane Drew would give up our class. I hate her. Her own nephew had a dirty plug of tobacco in his pocket, and offered us fellows a chew when Elder Clow was praying. I guess that's worse than a frog." "No, 'cause frogs are more unexpected like. They make more of a sensation. 'Sides, he wasn't caught at it. And then that praying competition you had last week has made a fearful scandal. Everybody is talking about it." "Why, the Blythes were in that as well as us," cried Faith indignantly. "It was Nan Blythe who suggested it in the first place, and Walter took the prize." "Well, you get the credit of it anyway. It wouldn't have been so bad if you hadn't had it in the graveyard." "I should think a graveyard was a very good place to pray in," retorted Jerry. "Deacon Hazard drove past when you were praying," said Mary, "and he saw and heard you, with your hands folded over your stomach, and groaning after every sentence. He thought you were making fun of him." "So I was," declared unabashed Jerry. "Only I didn't know he was going by, of course. That was just a mean accident. I wasn't praying in real earnest. I knew I had no chance of winning the prize, so I was just getting what fun I could out of it. Walter Blythe can pray bully. Why, he can't pray as well as Dad." "Una is the only one of us who really likes praying," said Faith pensively. "Well, if praying scandalizes people so much, we mustn't do it any more," sighed Una. "Shucks, you can pray all you want to, only not in the graveyard. And don't make a game of it. That was what made it so bad. That, and having a tea party on the tombstones." "We hadn't." "Well, a soap bubble party, then. It's something. The over-harbour people swear you had a tea party, but I'm willing to take your word. And you used this tombstone as a table." "Well, Martha wouldn't let us blow bubbles in the house. She was awful cross that day," explained Jerry. "And this old slab made such a jolly table." "Weren't they pretty?" cried Faith, her eyes sparkling over the remembrance. "They reflected the trees and the hills and the harbour like little fairy worlds, and when we shook them loose they floated away down to Rainbow Valley." "All but one, and it went over and bust up on the Methodist spire," said Carl. "I'm glad we did it once anyhow, before we found out it was wrong," said Faith. "It wouldn't have been wrong to blow them on the lawn," said Mary impatiently. "Seems like I can't knock any sense into your heads. You've been told often enough you shouldn't play in the graveyard. The Methodists are sensitive about it." "We forget," said Faith dolefully. "And the lawn is so small and so caterpillary, and so full of shrubs and things. We can't be in Rainbow Valley all the time, and where are we to go?" "It's the things you do in the graveyard. It wouldn't matter if you just sat here and talked quiet, same as we're doing now. Well, I don't know what is going to come of it all, but I do know that Elder Warren is going to speak to your pa about it. Deacon Hazard is his cousin." "I wish they wouldn't bother Father about us," said Una. "Well, people think he ought to bother himself about you a little more. I don't. I understand him. He's a child in some ways hisself. That's what he is, and needs someone to look after him as bad as you do. Well, perhaps he'll have someone before long, if all tales are true." "What do you mean?" asked Faith. "Haven't you got any idea? Honest?" demanded Mary. "No, no. What do you mean?" "Well, you are a lot of innocents, upon my word. Why, everybody is talking of it. Your pa goes to see Rosemary West. She is going to be your stepma." "I don't believe it," cried Una, flushing crimson. "Well, I dunno. I just go by what folks say. I don't give it for a fact. But it would be a good thing. Rosemary West'd make you toe the mark if she came here, I'll bet a cent, for all she's so sweet and smiley on the face of her. They're always that way till they've caught them. But you need someone to bring you up. You're disgracing your pa, and I feel for him. I've always thought an awful lot of your pa, ever since that night he talked to me so nice. I've never said a single swear word since, or told a lie. And I'd like to see him happy and comfortable, with his buttons on and his meals decent, and you young ones licked into shape, and that old cat of a Martha put in her proper place. The way she looked at the eggs I brought her tonight. 'I hope they're fresh,' says she. I just wished they was rotten. But you just mind that she gives you all one for breakfast, including your pa. Make a fuss if she doesn't. That was what they was sent up for. But I don't trust old Martha. She's quite capable of feeding 'em to her cat." Mary's tongue being temporarily tired, a brief silence fell over the graveyard. The manse children did not feel like talking. They were digesting the new and not altogether palatable ideas Mary had suggested to them. Jerry and Carl were somewhat startled. But, after all, what did it matter? And it wasn't likely there was a word of truth in it. Faith, on the whole, was pleased. Only Una was seriously upset. She felt that she would like to get away and cry. "Will there be any stars in my crown?" sang the Methodist choir, beginning to practice in the Methodist church. "I want just 3," said Mary, whose theological knowledge had increased notably since her residence with Mrs. Elliott. "Just 3, setting up upon my head, like a coronet, a big one in the middle, and a small one each side." "Are there different sizes in souls?" asked Carl. "Of course. Why, little babies must have smaller ones than big men. Well, it's getting dark, and I must scoot home. Mrs. Elliott doesn't like me to be out after dark. Laws, when I lived with Mrs. Wiley the dark was just the same as the daylight to me. I didn't mind it no more'n a gray cat. Them days seem 100 years ago. Now you mind what I've said, and try to behave yourselves, for your pa's sake. I'll always back you up and defend you. You can be dead sure of that. Mrs. Elliott says she never saw the like of me for sticking up for my friends. I was real sassy to Mrs. Alec Davis about you, and Mrs. Elliott combed me down for it afterwards. The fair Cornelia has a tongue of her own, and no mistake. But she was pleased underneath for all, 'cause she hates old Kitty Alec, and she's real fond of you. I can see through folks." Mary sailed off, excellently well pleased with herself, leaving a rather depressed little group behind her. "Mary Vance always says something that makes us feel bad when she comes up," said Una resentfully. "I wish we'd left her to starve in the old barn," said Jerry vindictively. "Oh, that's wicked, Jerry," rebuked Una. "May as well have the game as the name," retorted unrepentant Jerry. "If people say we're so bad, let's be bad." "But not if it hurts father," pleaded Faith. Jerry squirmed uncomfortably. He adored his father. Through the unshaded study window they could see Mr. Meredith at his desk. He did not seem to be either reading or writing. His head was in his hands, and there was something in his whole attitude that spoke of weariness and dejection. The children suddenly felt it. "I dare say somebody's been worrying him about us today," said Faith. "I wish we could get along without making people talk. Oh, Jem Blythe, how you scared me!" Jem Blythe had slipped into the graveyard and sat down beside the girls. He had been prowling about Rainbow Valley, and had succeeded in finding the first little star-white cluster of arbutus for his mother. The manse children were rather silent after his coming. Jem was beginning to grow away from them somewhat this spring. He was studying for the entrance examination of Queen's Academy, and stayed after school with the older pupils for extra lessons. Also, his evenings were so full of work that he seldom joined the others in Rainbow Valley now. He seemed to be drifting away into grown-up land. "What is the matter with you all tonight?" he asked. "There's no fun in you." "Not much," agreed Faith dolefully. "There wouldn't be much fun in you, either, if you knew you were disgracing your father and making people talk about you. Who's been talking about you now?" "Everybody, so Mary Vance says." And Faith poured out her troubles to sympathetic Jem. "You see," she concluded dolefully, "we've nobody to bring us up, and so we get into scrapes, and people think we're bad." "Why don't you bring yourselves up?" suggested Jem. "I'll tell you what to do. Form a good conduct club, and punish yourselves every time you do anything that's not right." "That's a good idea," said Faith, struck by it. "But," she added doubtfully, "things that don't seem a bit of harm to us seem simply dreadful to other people. How can we tell? We can't be bothering father all the time, and he has to be away a lot anyhow." "You could mostly tell if you stopped to think a thing over before doing it, and ask yourselves what the congregation would say about it," said Jem. "The trouble is you just rush into things and don't think them over at all. Mother says you're all too impulsive, just as she used to be. The Good Conduct Club would help you to think, if you were fair and honest about punishing yourselves when you broke the rules. You'd have to punish in some way that really hurt, or it wouldn't do any good." "Whip each other?" "Not exactly. You'd have to think up different ways of punishment to suit the person. You wouldn't punish each other, you'd punish yourselves. I read all about such a club in a storybook. You try it and see how it works." "Let's," said Faith. And when Jem was gone they agreed they would. "If things aren't right, we've just got to make them right," said Faith resolutely. "We've got to be fair and square, as Jem says," said Jerry. "This is a club to bring ourselves up, seeing there's nobody else to do it. There's no use in having many rules. Let's just have one, and any of us that breaks it has got to be punished hard." "But how?" "We'll think that up as we go along. We'll hold a session of the club here in the graveyard every night, and talk over what we've done through the day. And if we think we've done anything that isn't right, or that would disgrace Dad, the one that does it, or is responsible for it, must be punished. That's the rule. We'll all decide on the kind of punishment. It must be made to fit the crime, as Mr. Flagg says. And the one that's guilty will be bound to carry it out, and no shirking. There's going to be fun in this," concluded Jerry with a relish. "You suggested the soap bubble party," said Faith. "But that was before we'd formed the club," said Jerry hastily. "Everything starts from tonight." "But what if we can't agree on what's right, or what the punishment ought to be? Suppose 2 of us thought of one thing, and 2 another. There ought to be 5 in a club like this. We can ask Jem Blythe to be umpire. He is the squarest boy in Glen St. Mary. But I guess we can settle our own affairs mostly. We want to keep this as much of a secret as we can. Don't breathe a word to Mary Vance. She'd want to join and do the bringing up." "I think," said Faith, "that there's no use in spoiling every day by dragging punishments in. Let's have a punishment day." "We'd better choose Saturday, because there is no school to interfere," suggested Una. "And spoil the one holiday in the week," cried Faith. "Not much. No, let's take Friday. That's fish day anyhow, and we all hate fish. We may as well have all the disagreeable things in one day. Then other days we can go ahead and have a good time." "Nonsense," said Jerry authoritatively. "Such a scheme wouldn't work at all. We'll just punish ourselves as we go along, and keep a clear slate. Now we all understand, don't we? This is a good conduct club, for the purpose of bringing ourselves up. We agree to punish ourselves for bad conduct, and always to stop before we do anything, no matter what, and ask ourselves if it is likely to hurt Dad in any way, and anyone who shirks is to be cast out of the club and never allowed to play with the rest of us in Rainbow Valley again. Jem Blythe to be umpire in case of disputes. No more taking bugs to Sunday school, Carl, and no more chewing gum in public, if you please, Miss Faith." "No more making fun of elders praying or going to the Methodist prayer meeting," retorted Faith. "Why, it isn't any harm to go to the Methodist prayer meeting," protested Jerry in amazement. "Mrs. Elliott says it is. She says manse children have no business to go anywhere but to Presbyterian things." "Darn it, I won't give up going to the Methodist prayer meeting," cried Jerry. "It's 10 times more fun than ours is." "You said a naughty word," cried Faith. "Now, you've got to punish yourself." "Not till it's all down in black and white. We're only talking the club over. It isn't really formed until we've written it out and signed it. There's got to be a constitution and bylaws, and you know there's nothing wrong in going to a prayer meeting. But it's not only the wrong things we're to punish ourselves for, but anything that might hurt Father." "It won't hurt anybody. You know Mrs. Elliott is cracked on the subject of Methodists. Nobody else makes any fuss about my going. I always behave myself. You ask Jem or Mrs. Blythe and see what they say. I'll abide by their opinion. I'm going for the paper now, and I'll bring out the lantern, and we'll all sign." 15 minutes later the document was solemnly signed on Hezekiah Pollock's tombstone, on the center of which stood the smoky manse lantern, while the children knelt around it. Mrs. Elder Clow was going past at the moment, and next day all the Glen heard that the manse children had been having another praying competition, and had wound it up by chasing each other all over the graves with a lantern. This piece of embroidery was probably suggested by the fact that, after the signing and sealing was completed, Carl had taken the lantern and had walked circumspectly to the little hollow to examine his anthill. The others had gone quietly into the manse and to bed. "Do you think it is true that Father is going to marry Miss West?" Una had tremulously asked of Faith after their prayers had been said. "I don't know, but I'd like it," said Faith. "Oh, I wouldn't," said Una chokingly. "She is nice the way she is, but Mary Vance says it changes people altogether to be made stepmothers. They get horrid cross and mean and hateful then, and turn your father against you. She says they're sure to do that. She never knew it to fail in a single case." "I don't believe Miss West would ever try to do that," cried Faith. "Mary says anybody would. She knows all about stepmothers, Faith. She says she's seen hundreds of them, and you've never seen one. Oh, Mary has told me blood-curdling things about them. She says she knew of one who whipped her husband's little girls on their bare shoulders till they bled, and then shut them up in a cold, dark coal-cellar all night. She says they're all aching to do things like that. I don't believe Miss West would. You don't know her as well as I do, Una. Just think of that sweet little bird she sent me. I love it far more even than Adam. It's just being a stepmother changes them. Mary says they can't help it. I wouldn't mind the whippings so much as having father hate us." "You know nothing could make father hate us. Don't be silly, Una. I dare say there's nothing to worry over. Likely if we run our club right, and bring ourselves up properly, father won't think of marrying anyone. And if he does, I know Miss West will be lovely to us." But Una had no such conviction, and she cried herself to sleep. End of chapter 23. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter, Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 24. A Charitable Impulse. For a fortnight things ran smoothly in the Good Conduct Club. It seemed to work admirably. Not once was Jem Blythe called in as umpire. Not once did any of the manse children set the Glen gossips by the ears. As for their minor peccadilloes at home, they kept sharp tabs on each other, and gamely underwent their self-imposed punishment, generally a voluntary absence from some gay Friday night frolic in Rainbow Valley, or a sojourn in bed on some spring evening when all young bones ached to be out and away. Faith, for whispering in Sunday school, condemned herself to pass a whole day without speaking a single word, unless it was absolutely necessary, and accomplished it. It was rather unfortunate that Mr. Baker from over harbour should have chosen that evening for calling at the manse, and that Faith should have happened to go to the door. Not one word did she reply to his genial greeting, but went silently away to call her father briefly. Mr. Baker was slightly offended, and told his wife when he went home that biggest Meredith girl seemed a very shy, sulky little thing, without manners enough to speak when she was spoken to. But nothing worse came of it, and generally their penances did no harm to themselves or anybody else. All of them were beginning to feel quite cocksure that after all it was a very easy matter to bring yourself up. "I guess people will soon see that we can behave ourselves properly as well as anybody," said Faith jubilantly. "It isn't hard when we put our minds to it." She and Una were sitting on the Pollock tombstone. It had been a cold, raw, wet day of spring storm, and Rainbow Valley was out of the question for girls, though the manse and the Ingleside boys were down there fishing. The rain had held up, but the east wind blew mercilessly in from the sea, cutting to bone and marrow. Spring was late in spite of its early promise, and there was even yet a hard drift of old snow and ice in the northern corner of the graveyard. Leda Marsh, who had come up to bring the manse a mess of herring, slipped in through the gate shivering. She belonged to the fishing village at the harbour mouth, and her father had, for 30 years, made a practice of sending a mess from his first spring catch to the manse. He never darkened a church door. He was a hard drinker and a reckless man, but as long as he sent those herring up to the manse every spring, as his father had done before him, he felt comfortably sure that his account with the powers that govern was squared for the year. He would not have expected a good mackerel catch if he had not so sent the first fruits of the season. Leda was a mite of 10, and looked younger, because she was such a small, wizened little creature. Tonight, as she sidled boldly enough up to the manse girls, she looked as if she had never been warm since she was born. Her face was purple, and her pale blue, bold little eyes were red and watery. She wore a tattered print dress, and a ragged woolen comforter, tied across her thin shoulders and under her arms. She had walked the 3 miles from the harbour mouth barefooted, over a road where there was still snow and slush and mud. Her feet and legs were as purple as her face, but Lida did not mind this much. She was used to being cold, and she had been going barefooted for a month already, like all the other swarming young fry of the fishing village. There was no self-pity in her heart as she sat down on the tombstone and grinned cheerfully at Faith and Una. Faith and Una grinned cheerfully back. They knew Lida slightly, having met her once or twice the preceding summer when they had gone down the harbour with the Blythes. "Hello," said Lida. "Ain't this a fierce kind of a night? 'Tain't fit for a dog to be out, is it?" "Then why are you out?" asked Faith. "Pa made me bring you up some herring," returned Lida. She shivered, coughed, and stuck out her bare feet. Lida was not thinking about herself or her feet, and was making no bid for sympathy. She held her feet out instinctively to keep them from the wet grass around the tombstone. But Faith and Una were instantly swamped with a wave of pity for her. She looked so cold, so miserable. "Oh, why are you barefooted on such a cold night?" cried Faith. "Your feet must be almost frozen." "Pretty near," said Lida proudly. "I tell you it was fierce walking up that harbour road." "Why didn't you put on your shoes and stockings?" asked Una. "Ain't none to put on. All I had was wore out by the time winter was over," said Lida indifferently. For a moment Faith stared in horror. This was terrible. Here was a little girl, almost a neighbour, half frozen because she had no shoes or stockings in this cruel spring weather. Impulsively Faith thought of nothing but the dreadfulness of it. In a moment she was pulling off her own shoes and stockings. "Here, take these and put them right on," she said, forcing them into the hands of the astonished Lida. "Quick now, you'll catch your death of cold. I've got others. Put them right on." Lida, recovering her wits, snatched at the offered gift, with a sparkle in her dull eyes. Sure, she would put them on, and that mighty quick, before anyone appeared with authority to recall them. In a minute she had pulled the stockings over her scrawny little legs, and slipped Faith's shoes over her thick little ankles. "I'm obliged to you," she said, "but won't your folks be cross?" "No, and I don't care if they are," said Faith. "Do you think I could see anyone freezing to death without helping them if I could? It wouldn't be right, especially when my father's a minister." "Will you want them back? It's awful cold down at the harbour mouth, long after it's warm up here," said Lida slyly. "No, you're to keep them, of course. That is what I meant when I gave them. I have another pair of shoes and plenty of stockings." Lida had meant to stay a while and talk to the girls about many things, but now she thought she had better get away before somebody came and made her yield up her booty. So she shuffled off through the bitter twilight in the noiseless, shadowy way she had slipped in. As soon as she was out of sight of the manse, she sat down, took off the shoes and stockings, and put them in her herring basket. She had no intention of keeping them on down that dirty harbour road. They were to be kept good for gala occasions. Not another little girl down at the harbour mouth had such fine black cashmere stockings and such smart, almost new shoes. Lida was furnished forth for the summer. She had no qualms in the matter. In her eyes the manse people were quite fabulously rich, and no doubt those girls had slathers of shoes and stockings. Then Lida ran down to the Glen village and played for an hour with the boys before Mr. Flagg's store, splashing about in a pool of slush with the maddest of them, until Mrs. Elliot came along and bade her be gone home. "I don't think, Faith, that you should have done that," said Una, a little reproachfully, after Lida had gone. "You'll have to wear your good boots every day now, and they'll soon scuff out." "I don't care," cried Faith, still in the fine glow of having done a kindness to a fellow creature. "It isn't fair that I should have 2 pairs of shoes, and poor little Lida Marsh not have any. Now we both have a pair. You know perfectly well, Una, that Father said in his sermon last Sunday that there was no real happiness in getting or having, only in giving. And it's true. I feel far happier now than I ever did in my whole life before. Just think of Lida walking home this very minute, with her poor little feet all nice and warm and comfy." "You know, you haven't another pair of black cashmere stockings," said Una. "Your other pair were so full of holes that Aunt Martha said she couldn't darn them any more, and she cut the legs up for stove dusters. You've nothing but those 2 pairs of striped stockings you hate so." All the glow and uplift went out of Faith. Her gladness collapsed like a pricked balloon. She sat for a few dismal minutes in silence, facing the consequences of her rash act. "Oh, Una, I never thought of that," she said dolefully. "I didn't stop to think at all." The striped stockings were thick, heavy, coarse, ribbed stockings of blue and red, which Aunt Martha had knit for Faith in the winter. They were undoubtedly hideous. Faith loathed them, as she had never loathed anything before. Wear them she certainly would not. They were still unworn in her bureau drawer. "You'll have to wear the striped stockings after this," said Una. "Just think how the boys in school will laugh at you. You know how they laugh at Mamie Warren for her striped stockings, and call her barber pole, and yours are far worse." "I won't wear them," said Faith. "I'll go barefooted first, cold as it is." "You can't go barefooted to church tomorrow. Think what people would say." "Then I'll stay home." "You can't. You know very well Aunt Martha will make you go." Faith did know this. The one thing on which Aunt Martha troubled herself to insist was that they must all go to church, rain or shine. How they were dressed, or if they were dressed at all, never concerned her. But go they must. That was how Aunt Martha had been brought up 70 years ago, and that was how she meant to bring them up. "Haven't you got a pair you can lend me, Una?" said poor Faith piteously. Una shook her head. "No, you know I only have the one black pair, and they're so tight I can hardly get them on. They wouldn't go on you. Neither would my gray ones. Besides, the legs of them are all darned and darned." "I won't wear those striped stockings," said Faith stubbornly. "The feel of them is even worse than the looks. They make me feel as if my legs were as big as barrels, and they're so scratchy." "Well, I don't know what you're going to do. If Father was home I'd go and ask him to get me a new pair before the store closes, but he won't be home till too late. I'll ask him Monday, and I won't go to church tomorrow. I'll pretend I'm sick, and Aunt Martha'll have to let me stay home." "That would be acting a lie, Faith," cried Una. "You can't do that. You know it would be dreadful. What would Father say if he knew? Don't you remember how he talked to us after Mother died, and told us we must always be true, no matter what else we failed in? He said we must never tell or act a lie. He said he'd trust us not to. You can't do it, Faith. Just wear the striped stockings. It'll only be for once. Nobody will notice them in church. It isn't like school. And your new brown dress is so long they won't show much. Wasn't it lucky Aunt Martha made it big, so you'd have room to grow in it, for all you hated it so when she finished it?" "I won't wear those stockings," repeated Faith. She uncoiled her bare, white legs from the tombstone, and deliberately walked through the wet, cold grass to the bank of snow. Setting her teeth, she stepped upon it and stood there. "What are you doing?" cried Una, aghast. "You'll catch your death of cold, Faith Meredith." "I'm trying to," answered Faith. "I hope I'll catch a fearful cold and be awful sick tomorrow. Then I won't be acting a lie. I'm going to stand here as long as I can bear it." "But, Faith, you might really die. You might get pneumonia. Please, Faith, don't. Let's go into the house and get something for your feet. Oh, here's Jerry. I'm so thankful. Jerry, make Faith get off that snow. Look at her feet." "Holy cats! Faith, what are you doing?" demanded Jerry. "Are you crazy?" "No, go away!" snapped Faith. "Then are you punishing yourself for something? It isn't right if you are. You'll be sick." "I want to be sick. I'm not punishing myself. Go away." "Where's her shoes and stockings?" asked Jerry of Una. "She gave them to Lida Marsh." "Lida Marsh? What for?" "Because Lida had none, and her feet were so cold. And now she wants to be sick, so that she won't have to go to church tomorrow and wear her striped stockings. But, Jerry, she may die." "Faith," said Jerry, "get off that ice bank, or I'll pull you off." "Pull away!" dared Faith. Jerry sprang at her and caught her arms. He pulled one way, and Faith pulled another. Una ran behind Faith and pushed. Faith stormed at Jerry to leave her alone. Jerry stormed back at her not to be a dizzy idiot, and Una cried. They made no end of noise, and they were close to the road fence of the graveyard. Henry Warren and his wife drove by, and heard and saw them. Very soon the Glen heard that the manse children had been having an awful fight in the graveyard, and using most improper language. Meanwhile, Faith had allowed herself to be pulled off the ice because her feet were aching so sharply that she was ready to get off anyway. They all went in amiably and went to bed. Faith slept like a cherub and woke in the morning without a trace of a cold. She felt that she couldn't feign sickness and act a lie, after remembering that long-ago talk with her father. But she was still as fully determined as ever that she would not wear those abominable stockings to church. End of chapter 24. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter. Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 25. Another Scandal and Another Explanation. Faith went early to Sunday school, and was seated in the corner of her class pew before anyone came. Therefore, the dreadful truth did not burst upon anyone until Faith left the class pew near the door to walk up to the manse pew after Sunday school. The church was already half filled, and all who were sitting near the aisle saw that the minister's daughter had boots on, but no stockings. Faith's new brown dress, which Aunt Martha had made from an ancient pattern, was absurdly long for her, but even so it did not meet her boot tops. 2 good inches of bare white leg showed plainly. Faith and Carl sat alone in the manse pew. Jerry had gone into the gallery to sit with a chum, and the Blythe girls had taken Una with them. The Meredith children were given to sitting all over the church in this fashion, and a great many people thought it very improper. The gallery especially, where irresponsible lads congregated, and were known to whisper and suspected of chewing tobacco during service, was no place for a son of the manse. But Jerry hated the manse pew at the very top of the church, under the eyes of Elder Clow and his family. He escaped from it whenever he could. Carl, absorbed in watching a spider spinning its web at the window, did not notice Faith's legs. She walked home with her father after church, and he never noticed them. She got on the hated striped stockings before Jerry and Una arrived, so that for the time being none of the occupants of the manse knew what she had done. But nobody else in Glen St. Mary was ignorant of it. The few who had not seen soon heard. Nothing else was talked of on the way home from church. Mrs. Alec Davis said it was only what she expected, and the next thing you would see some of those young ones coming to church with no clothes on at all. The president of the Ladies' Aid decided that she would bring the matter up at the next aid meeting, and suggest that they wait in a body on the minister and protest. Miss Cornelia said that she, for her part, gave up. There was no use worrying over the manse fry any longer. Even Mrs. Dr. Blythe felt a little shocked, though she attributed the occurrence solely to Faith's forgetfulness. Susan could not immediately begin knitting stockings for Faith, because it was Sunday, but she had one set up before anyone else was out of bed at Ingleside the next morning. "You need not tell me anything but that it was old Martha's fault, Mrs. Dr. dear," she told Anne. "I suppose that poor little child had no decent stockings to wear. I suppose every stocking she had was in holes, as you know very well they generally are. And I think, Mrs. Dr. dear, that the Ladies' Aid would be better employed in knitting some for them than in fighting over the new carpet for the pulpit platform. I am not a Ladies' Aider, but I shall knit Faith 2 pairs of stockings out of this nice black yarn, as fast as my fingers can move, and that you may tie to. Never shall I forget my sensations, Mrs. Dr. dear, when I saw a minister's child walking up the aisle of our church with no stockings on. I really did not know what way to look." "And the church was just full of Methodists yesterday, too," groaned Miss Cornelia, who had come up to the Glen to do some shopping, and run into Ingleside to talk the affair over. "I don't know how it is, but just as sure as those manse children do something especially awful, the church is sure to be crowded with Methodists. I thought Mrs. Deacon Hazard's eyes would drop out of her head. When she came out of church, she said, 'Well, that exhibition was no more than decent. I do pity the Presbyterians.' And we just had to take it. There was nothing one could say." "There was something I could have said, Mrs. Dr. dear, if I had heard her," said Susan grimly. "I would have said, for one thing, that in my opinion clean bare legs were quite as decent as holes, and I would have said, for another, that the Presbyterians did not feel greatly in need of pity, seeing that they had a minister who could preach, and the Methodists had not. I could have squelched Mrs. Deacon Hazard, Mrs. Dr. dear, and that you may tie to." "I wish Mr. Meredith didn't preach quite so well, and looked after his family a little better," retorted Miss Cornelia. "He could at least glance over his children before they went to church, and see that they were quite properly clothed. I'm tired making excuses for him, believe me." Meanwhile, Faith's soul was being harrowed up in Rainbow Valley. Mary Vance was there, and, as usual, in a lecturing mood. She gave Faith to understand that she had disgraced herself and her father beyond redemption, and that she, Mary Vance, was done with her. Everybody was talking, and everybody said the same thing. "I simply feel that I can't associate with you any longer," she concluded. "We are going to associate with her, then," cried Nan Blythe. Nan secretly thought Faith had done a rather awful thing, but she wasn't going to let Mary Vance run matters in this high-handed fashion. "And if you are not, you needn't come any more to Rainbow Valley, Miss Vance." Nan and Di both put their arms around Faith and glared defiance at Mary. The latter suddenly crumpled up, sat down on a stump, and began to cry. "It ain't that I don't want to," she wailed, "but if I keep in with Faith, people'll be saying I put her up to doing things. Some are saying it now, true's you live. I can't afford to have such things said of me, now that I'm in a respectable place and trying to be a lady. And I never went bare-legged in church in my toughest days. I'd never have thought of doing such a thing. But that hateful old Kitty Alec says Faith has never been the same girl since that time I stayed in the manse. She says Cornelia Elliott will live to rue the day she took me in. It hurts my feelings, I tell you. But it's Mr. Meredith I'm really worried over." "I think you needn't worry about him," said Di scornfully. "It isn't likely necessary. Now, Faith, darling, stop crying and tell us why you did it." Faith explained tearfully. The Blythe girl sympathized with her, and even Mary Vance agreed that it was a hard position to be in. But Jerry, on whom the thing came like a thunderbolt, refused to be placated. So this was what some mysterious hints he had got in school that day meant. He marched Faith and Una home without ceremony, and the Good Conduct Club held an immediate session in the graveyard to sit in judgment on Faith's case. "I don't see that it was any harm," said Faith defiantly. "Not much of my legs showed. I wasn't wrong, and it didn't hurt anybody." "It will hurt Dad. You know it will. You know people blame him whenever we do anything queer." "I didn't think of that," muttered Faith. "That's just the trouble. You didn't think, and you should have thought. That's what our club is for, to bring us up and make us think. We promised we'd always stop and think before doing things. You didn't, and you've got to be punished, Faith, and real hard, too. You'll wear those striped stockings to school for a week for punishment. Oh, Jerry, won't a day do? 2 days? Not a whole week?" "Yes, a whole week," said inexorable Jerry. "It is fair. Ask Jem Blythe if it isn't." Faith felt she would rather submit than ask Jem Blythe about such a matter. She was beginning to realize that her offense was quite a shameful one. "I'll do it then," she muttered a little sulkily. "You're getting off easy," said Jerry severely, "and no matter how we punish you it won't help Father. People will always think you just did it for mischief, and they'll blame Father for not stopping it. We can never explain it to everybody." This aspect of the case weighed on Faith's mind. Her own condemnation she could bear, but it tortured her that her father should be blamed. If people knew the true facts of the case, they would not blame him. But how could she make them known to all the world? Getting up in church, as she had once done, and explaining the matter was out of the question. Faith had heard from Mary Vance how the congregation had looked upon that performance, and realized that she must not repeat it. Faith worried over the problem for half a week. Then she had an inspiration, and promptly acted upon it. She spent that evening in the garret, with a lamp and an exercise book, writing busily, with flushed cheeks and shining eyes. It was the very thing. How clever she was to have thought of it! It would put everything right and explain everything, and yet cause no scandal. It was 11 o'clock when she finished to her satisfaction, and crept down to bed, dreadfully tired, but perfectly happy. In a few days, the little weekly published in the Glen under the name of The Journal came out as usual, and the Glen had another sensation. A letter signed Faith Meredith occupied a prominent place on the front page, and ran as follows: To whom it may concern, I want to explain to everybody how it was I came to go to church without stockings on, so that everybody will know that Father was not to blame one bit for it, and the old gossips need not say he is, because it is not true. I gave my only pair of black stockings to Leda Marsh, because she hadn't any, and her poor little feet were awful cold, and I was so sorry for her. No child ought to have to go without shoes and stockings in a Christian community before the snow is all gone, and I think the W.F.M.S. ought to have given her stockings. Of course, I know they are sending things to the little heathen children, and that is all right, and a kind thing to do. But the little heathen children have lots more warm weather than we have, and I think the women of our church ought to look after Leda, and not leave it all to me. When I gave her my stockings, I forgot they were the only black pair I had without holes, but I am glad I did give them to her, because my conscience would have been uncomfortable if I hadn't. When she had gone away, looking so proud and happy, the poor little thing, I remembered that all I had to wear were the horrid red and blue things Aunt Martha knit last winter for me, out of some yarn that Mrs. Joseph Burr of Upper Glen sent us. It was dreadfully coarse yarn, and all knots, and I never saw any of Mrs. Burr's own children wearing things made of such yarn. But Mary Vance says Mrs. Burr gives the minister stuff that she can't use or eat herself, and thinks it ought to go as part of the salary her husband signed to pay, but never does. I just couldn't bear to wear those hateful stockings. They were so ugly and rough and felt so scratchy. Everybody would have made fun of me. I thought at first I'd pretend to be sick and not go to church next day, but I decided I couldn't do that, because it would be acting a lie, and Father told us after Mother died that was something we must never, never do. It is just as bad to act a lie as to tell one, though I know some people, right here in the Glen, who act them, and never seem to feel a bit bad about it. I will not mention any names, but I know who they are, and so does Father. Then I tried my best to catch cold and really be sick, by standing on the snowbank in the Methodist graveyard with my bare feet until Jerry pulled me off. But it didn't hurt me a bit, and so I couldn't get out of going to church. So I just decided I would put my boots on and go that way. I can't see why it was so wrong, and I was so careful to wash my legs just as clean as my face. But anyway, Father wasn't to blame for it. He was in the study thinking of his sermon and other heavenly things, and I kept out of his way before I went to Sunday school. Father does not look at people's legs in church, so of course he did not notice mine, but all the gossips did, and talked about it, and that is why I am writing this letter to the Journal to explain. I suppose I did very wrong, since everybody says so, and I am sorry, and I am wearing those awful stockings to punish myself, although Father bought me 2 nice new pairs as soon as Mr. Flagg's store opened on Monday morning. But it was all my fault, and if people blame Father for it after they read this, they are not Christians, and so I do not mind what they say. There is another thing I want to explain about before I stop. Mary Vance told me that Mr. Even Boyd is blaming the Lou Baxters for stealing potatoes out of his field last fall. They did not touch his potatoes. They are very poor, but they are honest. It was us did it, Jerry and Carl and I. Una was not with us at the time. We never thought it was stealing. We just wanted a few potatoes to cook over a fire in Rainbow Valley one evening to eat with our fried trout. Mr. Boyd's field was the nearest, just between the valley and the village, so we climbed over his fence and pulled up some stalks. The potatoes were awful small, because Mr. Boyd did not put enough fertilizer on them, and we had to pull up a lot of stalks before we got enough, and then they were not much bigger than marbles. Walter and Di Blythe helped us eat them, but they did not come along until we had them cooked, and did not know where we got them, so they were not to blame at all, only us. We didn't mean any harm, but if it was stealing, we are very sorry, and we will pay Mr. Boyd for them if he will wait until we grow up. We never have any money now, because we are not big enough to earn any, and Aunt Martha says it takes every cent of poor father's salary, even when it is paid up regularly, and it isn't often, to run this house. But Mr. Boyd must not blame the Lou Baxters any more, when they were quite innocent, and give them a bad name. Yours respectfully, Faith Meredith. End of chapter 25. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter, Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 26. Miss Cornelia Gets a New Point of View. Susan, after I'm dead, I'm going to come back to earth every time when the daffodils blow in this garden, said Anne rapturously. Nobody may see me, but I'll be here, if anybody is in the garden at the time. I think I'll come on an evening just like this, but it might be just at dawn, a lovely pale pinky spring dawn. They'll just see the daffodils nodding wildly, as if an extra gust of wind had blown past them, but it will be I. Indeed, Mrs. Dr. dear, you will not be thinking of flaunting worldly things like daffies after you are dead, said Susan. And I do not believe in ghosts, seen or unseen. Oh, Susan, I shall not be a ghost. That has such a horrible sound. I shall just be me, and I shall run around in the twilight, whether it is morn or eve, and see all the spots I love. Do you remember how badly I felt when I left our little house of dreams, Susan? I thought I could never love Ingleside so well, but I do. I love every inch of the ground and every stick and stone on it. I am rather fond of the place myself, said Susan, who would have died if she had been removed from it. But we must not set our affections too much on earthly things, Mrs. Dr. dear. There are such things as fires and earthquakes. We should always be prepared. The Tom McAllisters over harbour were burned out 3 nights ago. Some say Tom McAllister set the house on fire himself to get the insurance. That may or may not be, but I advise the doctor to have our chimneys seen to at once. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. But I see Mrs. Marshall Elliott coming in at the gate, looking as if she had been sent for, and couldn't go. Anne, dearie, have you seen the Journal today? Miss Cornelia's voice was trembling, partly from emotion, partly from the fact that she had hurried up from the store too fast and lost her breath. Anne bent over the daffodils to hide a smile. She and Gilbert had laughed heartily and heartlessly over the front page of the Journal that day, but she knew that to dear Miss Cornelia it was almost a tragedy, and she must not wound her feelings by any display of levity. "Isn't it dreadful? What is to be done?" asked Miss Cornelia despairingly. Miss Cornelia had vowed that she was done with worrying over the pranks of the manse children, but she went on worrying just the same. Anne led the way to the veranda, where Susan was knitting, with Shirley and Rilla conning their primers on either side. Susan was already on her second pair of stockings for Faith. Susan never worried over poor humanity. She did what in her lay for its betterment, and serenely left the rest to the higher powers. "Cornelia Elliott thinks she was born to run this world, Mrs. Dr. dear," she had once said to Anne, "and so she is always in a stew over something. I have never thought I was, and so I go calmly along, not but what it has sometimes occurred to me that things might be run a little better than they are. But it is not for us poor worms to nourish such thoughts. They only make us uncomfortable, and do not get us anywhere." "I don't see that anything can be done now," said Anne, pulling out a nice cushiony chair for Miss Cornelia. "But how in the world did Mr. Vickers allow that letter to be printed? Surely he should have known better." "Why, he's away, Anne dearie. He's been away to New Brunswick for a week, and that young scalawag of a Joe Vickers is editing the journal in his absence. Of course, Mr. Vickers would never have put it in, even if he is a Methodist. But Joe would just think it a good joke. As you say, I don't suppose there is anything to be done now, only live it down. But if I ever get Joe Vickers cornered somewhere, I'll give him a talking to he won't forget in a hurry. I wanted Marshall to stop our subscription to the journal instantly, but he only laughed and said that today's issue was the only one that had anything readable in it for a year. Marshall never will take anything seriously, just like a man. Fortunately, even Boyd is like that too. He takes it as a joke and is laughing all over the place about it. And he's another Methodist. As for Mrs. Burr of Upper Glen, of course she will be furious, and they will leave the church. Not that it will be a great loss from any point of view. The Methodists are quite welcome to them." "It serves Mrs. Burr right," said Susan, who had an old feud with the lady in question, and had been hugely tickled over the reference to her in Faith's letter. "She will find that she will not be able to cheat the Methodist parson out of his salary with bad yarn." "The worst of it is, there's not much hope of things getting any better," said Miss Cornelia gloomily. "As long as Mr. Meredith was going to see Rosemary West, I did hope that Mance would soon have a proper mistress, but that is all off. I suppose she wouldn't have him on account of the children. At least, everybody seems to think so." "I do not believe that he ever asked her," said Susan, who could not conceive of any one refusing a minister. "Well, nobody knows anything about that. But one thing is certain, he doesn't go there any longer, and Rosemary didn't look well all the spring. I hope her visit to Kingsport will do her good. She has been gone for a month, and will stay another month, I understand. I can't remember when Rosemary was away from home before. She and Ellen could never bear to be parted, but I understand Ellen insisted on her going this time. And meanwhile, Ellen and Norman Douglas are warming up the old soup." "Is that really so?" asked Anne, laughing. "I heard a rumour of it, but I hardly believed it." "Believe it! You may believe it all right, Anne dearie. Nobody is in ignorance of it. Norman Douglas never left anybody in doubt as to his intentions in regard to anything. He always did his courting before the public. He told Marshall that he hadn't thought about Ellen for years, but the first time he went to church last fall he saw her, and fell in love with her all over again. He said he'd clean forgot how handsome she was. He hadn't seen her for 20 years, if you can believe it. Of course, he never went to church, and Ellen never went anywhere else round here. Oh, we all know what Norman means, but what Ellen means is a different matter. I shan't take it upon me to predict whether it will be a match or not. He jilted her once, but it seems that does not count with some people, Mrs. Dr. dear," Susan remarked rather acidly. "He jilted her in a fit of temper and repented it all his life," said Miss Cornelia. "That is different from a cold-blooded jilting. For my part, I never detested Norman as some folks do. He could never overcrow me. I do wonder what started him coming to church. I have never been able to believe Mrs. Wilson's story, that Faith Meredith went there and bullied him into it. I've always intended to ask Faith herself, but I've never happened to think of it just when I saw her. What influence could she have over Norman Douglas? He was in the store when I left, bellowing with laughter over that scandalous letter. You could have heard him at Four Winds Point. 'The greatest girl in the world,' he was shouting. 'She's that full of spunk she's bursting with it, and all the old grannies want to tame her, darn them. but they'll never be able to do it. Never! They might as well try to drown a fish. Boyd, see that you put more fertilizer on your potatoes next year. Ho, ho, ho!" And then he laughed till the roof shook. "Mr. Douglas pays well to the salary, at least," remarked Susan. "Oh, Norman isn't mean in some ways. He'd give 1,000 without blinking a lash, and roar like a bull of Bashan if he had to pay 5 cents too much for anything. Besides, he likes Mr. Meredith's sermons, and Norman Douglas was always willing to shell out if he got his brains tickled up. There is no more Christianity about him than there is about a black naked heathen in Africa, and never will be. But he's clever and well read, and he judges sermons as he would lectures. Anyhow, it's well he backs up Mr. Meredith and the children as he does, for they'll need friends more than ever after this. I am tired of making excuses for them, believe me." "Do you know, dear Miss Cornelia," said Anne seriously, "I think we have all been making too many excuses. It is very foolish, and we ought to stop it. I'm going to tell you what I'd like to do. I shan't do it, of course." Anne had noted a glint of alarm in Susan's eye. "It would be too unconventional, and we must be conventional or die after we reach what is supposed to be a dignified age. But I'd like to do it. I'd like to call a meeting of the Ladies' Aid and W.M.S. and the Girls' Sewing Society, and include in the audience all and any Methodists who have been criticizing the Merediths, although I do think if we Presbyterians stopped criticizing and excusing, we would find that other denominations would trouble themselves very little about our manse folks. I would say to them, 'Dear Christian friends,' with marked emphasis on Christian, 'I have something to say to you, and I want to say it good and hard, that you may take it home and repeat it to your families. You Methodists need not pity us, and we Presbyterians need not pity ourselves. We are not going to do it any more, and we are going to say, boldly and truthfully, to all critics and sympathizers, we are proud of our minister and his family. Mr. Meredith is the best preacher Glen St. Mary Church ever had. Moreover, he is a sincere, earnest teacher of truth and Christian charity. He is a faithful friend, a judicious pastor in all essentials, and a refined, scholarly, well-bred man. His family are worthy of him. Gerald Meredith is the cleverest pupil in the Glen School, and Mr. Hazard says that he is destined to a brilliant career. He is a manly, honourable, truthful little fellow. Faith Meredith is a beauty, and as inspiring and original as she is beautiful. There is nothing commonplace about her. All the other girls in the Glen put together haven't the vim and wit and joyousness and spunk she has. She is not an enemy in the world. Everyone who knows her loves her. Of how many, children or grown-ups, can that be said? Una Meredith is sweetness personified. She will make a most lovable woman. Carl Meredith, with his love for ants and frogs and spiders, will some day be a naturalist whom all Canada, nay, all the world, will delight to honour. Do you know of any other family in the Glen, or out of it, of whom all these things can be said? Away with shamefaced excuses and apologies. We rejoice in our minister and his splendid boys and girls." Anne stopped, partly because she was out of breath after her vehement speech, and partly because she could not trust herself to speak further in view of Miss Cornelia's face. That good lady was staring helplessly at Anne, apparently engulfed in billows of new ideas. But she came up with a gasp and struck out for shore gallantly. "Anne Blythe, I wish you would call that meeting and say just that. You've made me ashamed of myself, for one, and far be it from me to refuse to admit it. Of course, that is how we should have talked, especially to the Methodists, and it's every word of it true, every word. We've just been shutting our eyes to the big, worthwhile things and squinting them on the little things that don't really matter a pin's worth. Oh, Anne dearie, I can see a thing when it's hammered into my head. No more apologizing for Cornelia Marshall. I shall hold my head up after this, believe me, though I may talk things over with you as usual, just to relieve my feelings, if the Merediths do any more startling stunts. Even that letter I felt so bad about, why, it's only a good joke after all, as Norman says. Not many girls would have been cute enough to think of writing it, and all punctuated so nicely, and not one word misspelled. Just let me hear any Methodist say one word about it. Though, all the same, I'll never forgive Joe Vickers. Believe me. Believe me. Where are the rest of your small fry tonight? Walter and the twins are in Rainbow Valley. Jem is studying in the garret. They are all crazy about Rainbow Valley. Mary Vance thinks it's the only place in the world. She'd be off up here every evening if I'd let her, but I don't encourage her in gadding. Besides, I miss the creature when she isn't around, Anne dearie. I never thought I'd get so fond of her. Not but when I see her faults and try to correct them. But she has never said one saucy word to me since she came to my house, and she is a great help. For when all is said and done, Anne dearie, I am not so young as I once was, and there is no sense denying it. I was 59 my last birthday. I don't feel it, but there is no gainsaying the family Bible. End of chapter 26. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter, Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 27. A Sacred Concert. In spite of Miss Cornelia's new point of view, she could not help feeling a little disturbed over the next performance of the manse children. In public she carried off the situation splendidly, saying to all the gossips the substance of what Anne had said in Daffodil Time, and saying it so pointedly and forcibly that her hearers found themselves feeling rather foolish, and began to think that, after all, they were making too much of a childish prank. But in private Miss Cornelia allowed herself the relief of bemoaning it to Anne. "Anne, dearie, they had a concert in the graveyard last Thursday evening while the Methodist prayer meeting was going on. There they sat, on Hezekiah Pollock's tombstone, and sang for a solid hour. Of course, I understand it was mostly hymns they sang, and it wouldn't have been quite so bad if they'd done nothing else, but I'm told they finished up with Polly Wolly Doodle at full length, and that just when Deacon Baxter was praying." "I was there all night," said Susan, "and although I did not say anything about it to you, Mrs. Dr. dear, I could not help thinking that it was a great pity they picked that particular evening. It was truly blood-curdling to hear them sitting there in that abode of the dead, shouting that frivolous song at the top of their lungs." "I don't know what you were doing in a Methodist prayer meeting," said Miss Cornelia acidly. "I have never found that Methodism was catching," retorted Susan stiffly. "And as I was going to say when I was interrupted, badly as I felt, I did not give in to the Methodists. When Mrs. Deacon Baxter said, as we came out, 'What a disgraceful exhibition,' I said, looking her fairly in the eye, 'They are all beautiful singers, and none of your choir, Mrs. Baxter, ever bother themselves coming out to your prayer meetings, it seems. Their voices appear to be in tune only on Sundays.' She was quite meek, and I felt that I had snubbed her properly. But I could have done it much more thoroughly, Mrs. Dr. dear, if only they had left out Polly Wolly Doodle. It is truly terrible to think of that being sung in a graveyard." "Some of those dead folks sang Polly Wolly Doodle when they were living, Susan. Perhaps they like to hear it yet," suggested Gilbert. Miss Cornelia looked at him reproachfully, and made up her mind that on some future occasion she would hint to Anne that the doctor should be admonished not to say such things. They might injure his practice. People might get it into their heads that he wasn't orthodox. To be sure, Marshall said even worse things habitually, but then he was not a public man. "I understand that their father was in his study all the time, with his windows open, but never noticed them at all. Of course, he was lost in a book as usual, but I spoke to him about it yesterday when he called." "How could you dare, Mrs. Marshall Elliott?" asked Susan rebukingly. "Dare? It's time somebody dared something. Why, they say he knows nothing about that letter of Faith's to the journal, because nobody liked to mention it to him. He never looks at a journal, of course, but I thought he ought to know of this to prevent any such performances in future. He said he would discuss it with them, but of course he'd never think of it again after he got out of our gate. That man has no sense of humor, Anne, believe me. He preached last Sunday on how to bring up children. A beautiful sermon it was, too. And everybody in church thinking, what a pity you can't practice what you preach. Miss Cornelia did Mr. Meredith an injustice in thinking he would soon forget what she had told him. He went home much disturbed, and when the children came from Rainbow Valley that night, at a much later hour than they should have been prowling in it, he called them into his study. They went in, somewhat awed. It was such an unusual thing for their father to do. What could he be going to say to them? They racked their memories for any recent transgression of sufficient importance, but could not recall any. Carl had spilled a saucerful of jam on Mrs. Peter Flagg's silk dress 2 evenings before, when, at Aunt Martha's invitation, she had stayed to supper. But Mr. Meredith had not noticed it, and Mrs. Flagg, who was a kindly soul, had made no fuss. Besides, Carl had been punished by having to wear Una's dress all the rest of the evening. Una suddenly thought that perhaps her father meant to tell them that he was going to marry Miss West. Her heart began to beat violently, and her legs trembled. Then she saw that Mr. Meredith looked very stern and sorrowful. No, it could not be that. "Children," said Mr. Meredith, "I have heard something that has pained me very much. Is it true that you sat out in the graveyard all last Thursday evening and sang ribald songs while a prayer meeting was being held in the Methodist church?" "Great Caesar, Dad! We forgot all about it being their prayer meeting night!" exclaimed Jerry in dismay. "Then it is true. You did do this thing?" "Why, Dad, I don't know what you mean by ribald songs. We sang hymns. It was a sacred concert, you know. What harm was that?" "I tell you, we never thought about its being Methodist prayer meeting night. They used to have their meeting Tuesday nights, and since they've changed to Thursdays, it's hard to remember." "Did you sing nothing but hymns?" "Why," said Jerry, turning red, "we did sing Polly Wolly Doodle at the last. Faith said, 'Let's have something cheerful to wind up with.' But we didn't mean any harm, Father. Truly, we didn't." "The concert was my idea, Father," said Faith, afraid that Mr. Meredith might blame Jerry too much. "You know the Methodists themselves had a sacred concert in their church 3 Sunday nights ago. I thought it would be good fun to get one up in imitation of it. Only they had prayers at theirs, and we left that part out, because we heard that people thought it awful for us to pray in a graveyard. You were sitting in here all the time," she added, "and never said a word to us." "I did not notice what you were doing. That is no excuse for me, of course. I am more to blame than you, I realize that. But why did you sing that foolish song at the end?" "We didn't think," muttered Jerry, feeling that it was a very lame excuse, seeing that he had lectured Faith so strongly in the Good Conduct Club sessions for her lack of thought. "We're sorry, Father. Truly we are. Pitch into us hard. We deserve a regular combing down." But Mr. Meredith did no combing down or pitching into. He sat down and gathered his small culprits close to him, and talked a little to them, tenderly and wisely. They were overcome with remorse and shame, and felt that they could never be so silly and thoughtless again. "We've just got to punish ourselves good and hard for this," whispered Jerry as they crept upstairs. "We'll have a session of the club first thing tomorrow and decide how we'll do it. I never saw Father so cut up. But I wish to goodness the Methodists would stick to one night for their prayer meeting and not wander all over the week. Anyhow, I'm glad it wasn't what I was afraid it was," murmured Una to herself. Behind them in the study, Mr. Meredith had sat down at his desk and buried his face in his arms. "God help me," he said. "I'm a poor sort of father. Oh, Rosemary, if you had only cared." End of chapter 27. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter. Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 28. A Fast Day. The Good Conduct Club had a special session the next morning before school. After various suggestions, it was decided that a fast day would be an appropriate punishment. "We won't eat a single thing for a whole day," said Jerry. "I'm kind of curious to see what fasting is like, anyhow. This will be a good chance to find out." "What day will we choose for it?" asked Una, who thought it would be quite an easy punishment, and rather wondered that Jerry and Faith had not devised something harder. "Let's pick Monday," said Faith. "We mostly have a pretty filling dinner on Sundays, and Monday's meals never amount to much anyhow." "But that's just the point," exclaimed Jerry. "We mustn't take the easiest day to fast, but the hardest. And that's Sunday, because, as you say, we mostly have roast beef that day instead of cold ditto. It wouldn't be much punishment to fast from ditto. Let's take next Sunday. It will be a good day, for Father is going to exchange for the morning service with the Upper Lowbridge minister. Father will be away till evening. If Aunt Martha wonders what's got into us, we'll tell her right up that we're fasting for the good of our souls, and it is in the Bible, and she is not to interfere. And I guess she won't." Aunt Martha did not. She merely said in her fretful, mumbling way, "What foolishness are you young rips up to now?" and thought no more about it. Mr. Meredith had gone away early in the morning, before anyone was up. He went without his breakfast, too, but that was, of course, of common occurrence. Half of the time he forgot it, and there was no one to remind him of it. Breakfast, Aunt Martha's breakfast, was not a hard meal to miss. Even the hungry young rips did not feel it any great deprivation to abstain from the lumpy porridge and blue milk, which had aroused the scorn of Mary Vance. But it was different at dinner time. They were furiously hungry then, and the odour of roast beef, which pervaded the manse, and which was wholly delightful in spite of the fact that the roast beef was badly underdone, was almost more than they could stand. In desperation they rushed to the graveyard, where they couldn't smell it. But Una could not keep her eyes from the dining-room window, through which the Upper Lowbridge minister could be seen, placidly eating. "If I could only have just a weeny, teeny piece," she sighed. "Now you stop that," commanded Jerry. "Of course it's hard, but that's the punishment of it. I could eat a graven image this very minute, but am I complaining? Let's think of something else. We've just got to rise above our stomachs." At supper time they did not feel the pangs of hunger, which they had suffered earlier in the day. "I suppose we're getting used to it," said Faith. "I feel an awfully queer, all-gone sort of feeling, but I can't say I'm hungry." "My head is funny," said Una. "It goes round and round sometimes." But she went gamely to church with the others. If Mr. Meredith had not been so wholly wrapped up in and carried away with his subject, he might have noticed the pale little face and hollow eyes in the manse pew beneath. But he noticed nothing, and his sermon was something longer than usual. Then, just before he gave out the final hymn, Una Meredith tumbled off the seat of the manse pew, and lay in a dead faint on the floor. Mrs. Elder Clow was the first to reach her. She caught the thin little body from the arms of white-faced, terrified Faith, and carried it into the vestry. Mr. Meredith forgot the hymn and everything else, and rushed madly after her. The congregation dismissed itself as best it could. "Oh, Mrs. Clow," gasped Faith, "is Una dead? Have we killed her?" "What is the matter with my child?" demanded the pale father. "She has just fainted, I think," said Mrs. Clow. "Oh, here's the doctor, thank goodness." Gilbert did not find it a very easy thing to bring Una back to consciousness. He worked over her for a long time before her eyes opened. Then he carried her over to the manse, followed by Faith, sobbing hysterically in her relief. "She's just hungry, you know. She didn't eat a thing today. None of us did. We were all fasting." "Fasting!" said Mr. Meredith. And "Fasting?" said the doctor. "Yes, to punish ourselves for singing Polly Wolly in the graveyard." "My child, I don't want you to punish yourselves for that," said Mr. Meredith in distress. "I gave you your little scolding, and you were all penitent, and I forgave you." "Yes, but we had to be punished," explained Faith. "It's our rule, in our Good Conduct Club, you know. If we do anything wrong, or anything that is likely to hurt Father and the congregation, we have to punish ourselves. We are bringing ourselves up, you know, because there is nobody to do it." Mr. Meredith groaned, but the doctor got up from Una's side with an air of relief. "Then this child simply fainted from lack of food, and all she needs is a good square meal," he said. "Mrs. Clow, will you be kind enough to see she gets it? And I think from Faith's story that they would all be the better for something to eat, or we shall have more faintings." "I suppose we shouldn't have made Una fast," said Faith remorsefully. "When I think of it, only Jerry and I should have been punished. We got up the concert, and we were the oldest." "I sang Polly Wolly just the same as the rest of you," said Una's weak little voice, "so I had to be punished too." Mrs. Clow came with a glass of milk. Faith and Jerry and Carl sneaked off to the pantry, and John Meredith went into his study, where he sat in the darkness for a long time, alone with his bitter thoughts. So his children were bringing themselves up because there was nobody to do it, struggling along amid their little perplexities without a hand to guide or a voice to counsel. Faith's innocently uttered phrase rankled in her father's mind like a barbed shaft. There was nobody to look after them, to comfort their little souls and care for their little bodies. How frail Una had looked, lying there on the vestry sofa in that long faint. How thin were her tiny hands, how pallid her little face. She looked as if she might slip away from him in a breath, sweet little Una, of whom Cecilia had begged him to take such special care. Since his wife's death he had not felt such an agony of dread as when he had hung over his little girl in her unconsciousness. He must do something. But what? Should he ask Elizabeth Kirke to marry him? She was a good woman. She would be kind to his children. He might bring himself to do it, if it were not for his love for Rosemary West. But until he had crushed that out, he could not seek another woman in marriage. And he could not crush it out. He had tried, and he could not. Rosemary had been in church that evening, for the first time since her return from Kingsport. He had caught a glimpse of her face in the back of the crowded church, just as he had finished his sermon. His heart had given a fierce throb. He sat while the choir sang the collection piece, with his bent head and tingling pulses. He had not seen her since the evening upon which he had asked her to marry him. When he had risen to give out the hymn, his hands were trembling and his pale face was flushed. Then Una's fainting spell had banished everything from his mind for a time. Now in the darkness and solitude of the study it rushed back. Rosemary was the only woman in the world for him. It was of no use for him to think of marrying any other. He could not commit such a sacrilege, even for his children's sake. He must take up his burden alone. He must try to be a better, a more watchful father. He must tell his children not to be afraid to come to him with all their little problems. Then he lighted his lamp and took up a bulky new book which was setting the theological world by the ears. He would read just one chapter to compose his mind. 5 minutes later he was lost to the world and the troubles of the world. End of chapter 28. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter. Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 29. A Weird Tale. On an early June evening, Rainbow Valley was an entirely delightful place, and the children felt it to be so, as they sat in the open glade where the bells rang elfishly on the tree lovers, and the White Lady shook her green tresses. The wind was laughing and whistling about them like a leal, glad-hearted comrade. The young ferns were spicy in the hollow. The wild cherry trees, scattered over the valley among the dark firs, were mistily white. The robins were whistling over in the maples behind Ingleside. Beyond, on the slopes of the glen, were blossoming orchards, sweet and mystic and wonderful, veiled in dusk. It was spring, and young things must be glad in spring. Everybody was glad in Rainbow Valley that evening, until Mary Vance froze their blood with the story of Henry Warren's ghost. Jem was not there. Jem spent his evenings now studying for his entrance examination in the Ingleside garret. Jerry was down near the pond, trouting. Walter had been reading Longfellow's sea poems to the others, and they were steeped in the beauty and mystery of the ships. Then they talked of what they would do when they were grown up, where they would travel, the far, fair shores they would see. Nan and Di meant to go to Europe. Walter longed for the Nile, moaning past its Egyptian sands, and a glimpse of the Sphinx. Faith opined rather dismally that she supposed she would have to be a missionary. Old Mrs. Taylor had told her she ought to be. And then she would at least see India or China, those mysterious lands of the Orient. Carl's heart was set on African jungles. Una said nothing. She thought she would just like to stay at home. It was prettier here than anywhere else. It would be dreadful when they were all grown up and had to scatter all over the world. The very idea made Una feel lonesome and homesick. But the others dreamed on delightedly until Mary Vance arrived and banished Posy and dreams at one fell swoop. "Laws, but I'm out of puff!" she exclaimed. "I've run down that hill like 60. I got an awful scare up there at the Old Bailey place." "What frightened you?" asked Di. "I don't know. I was poking about under them lilacs in the old garden, trying to see if there was any lilies of the valley out yet. It was dark as a pocket there, and all at once I seen something stirring and rustling round at the other side of the garden in those cherry bushes. It was white. I tell you I didn't stop for a second look. I flew over the dike quicker than quick. I was sure it was Henry Warren's ghost." "Who was Henry Warren?" asked Di. "And why should he have a ghost?" asked Nan. "Laws, did you never hear the story? And you brought up in the glen. Well, wait a minute till I get my breath all back, and I'll tell you." Walter shivered delightsomely. He loved ghost stories. Their mystery, their dramatic climaxes, their eeriness gave him a fearful, exquisite pleasure. Longfellow instantly grew tame and commonplace. He threw the book aside and stretched himself out, propped upon his elbows to listen wholeheartedly, fixing his great luminous eyes on Mary's face. Mary wished he wouldn't look at her so. She felt she could make a better job of the ghost story if Walter were not looking at her. She could put on several frills and invent a few artistic details to enhance the horror. As it was, she had to stick to the bare truth, or what had been told her for the truth. "Well," she began, "you know old Tom Bailey and his wife used to live in that house up there 30 years ago. He was an awful old rip, they say, and his wife wasn't much better. They'd no children of their own, but a sister of old Tom's died and left a little boy, this Henry Warren, and they took him. He was about 12 when he came to them, and kind of undersized and delicate. They say Tom and his wife used him awful from the start, whipped him and starved him. Folks said they wanted to kill him so they could get the little bit of money his mother had left for him. Henry didn't die right off, but he begun having fits, epileps they called 'em, and he grew up kind of simple, till he was about 18. His uncle used to thrash him in that garden up there, 'cause it was back of the house where no one could see him. But folks could hear, and they say it was awful sometimes, hearing poor Henry plead with his uncle not to kill him. But nobody dared interfere, 'cause old Tom was such a reprobate he'd have been sure to get square with 'em some way. He burned the barns of a man at Harborhead who offended him. At last Henry died, and his uncle and aunt give out he died in one of his fits, and that was all anybody ever knowed, but everybody said Tom had just up and killed him for keeps at last. And it wasn't long till it got round that Henry walked. That old garden was haunted. He was heard there at nights, moaning and crying. Old Tom and his wife got out. Went out west and never came back. The place got such a bad name, nobody'd buy or rent it. That's why it's all gone to ruin. That was 30 years ago. But Henry Warren's ghost haunts it yet." "Do you believe that?" asked Nan scornfully. "I don't." "Well, good people have seen him, and heard him," retorted Mary. "They say he appears and grovels on the ground, and holds you by the legs and jibbers, and moans like he did when he was alive. I thought of that as soon as I seen that white thing in the bushes, and thought if it caught me like that and moaned, I'd drop down dead on the spot. So I cut and run. It mightn't have been his ghost, but I wasn't going to take any chances with a haunt." "It was likely old Mrs. Stimson's white calf," laughed Di. "It pastures in that garden. I've seen it." "Maybe so, but I'm not going home through the Bailey garden any more. Here's Jerry with a big string of trout, and it's my turn to cook them. Jem and Jerry both say I'm the best cook in the glen. And Cornelia told me I could bring up this batch of cookies. I all but dropped them when I saw Henry's ghost." Jerry hooted when he heard the ghost story, which Mary repeated as she fried the fish, touching it up a trifle or so, since Walter had gone to help Faith set the table. It made no impression on Jerry, but Faith and Una and Carl had been secretly much frightened, though they would never have given in to it. It was all right as long as the others were with them in the valley, but when the feast was over and the shadows fell, they quaked with remembrance. Jerry went up to Ingleside with the Blythes to see Jem about something, and Mary Vance went around that way home. So Faith and Una and Carl had to go back to the manse alone. They walked very close together, and gave the old Bailey garden a wide berth. They did not believe that it was haunted, of course, but they would not go near it for all that. End of chapter 29. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter. Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 30. The Ghost on the Dyke. Somehow Faith, Carl, and Una could not shake off the hold which the story of Henry Warren's ghost had taken upon their imaginations. They had never believed in ghosts. Ghost tales they had heard aplenty. Mary Vance had told some far more blood-curdling than this. But those tales were all of places and people and spooks, far away and unknown. After the first half-awful, half-pleasant thrill of awe and terror, they thought of them no more. But this story came home to them. The old Bailey garden was almost at their very door, almost in their beloved Rainbow Valley. They had passed and repassed it constantly. They had hunted for flowers in it. They had made short-cuts through it when they wished to go straight from the village to the valley. But never again. After the night when Mary Vance told them its gruesome tale, they would not have gone through or near it on pain of death. Death! What was death compared to the unearthly possibility of falling into the clutches of Henry Warren's groveling ghost? One warm July evening the three of them were sitting under the Tree Lovers, feeling a little lonely. Nobody else had come near the valley that evening. Jem Blythe was away in Charlottetown, writing on his entrance examinations. Jerry and Walter Blythe were off for a sail on the harbour with old Captain Crawford. Nan and Di and Rilla and Shirley had gone down the harbour road to visit Kenneth and Persis Ford, who had come with their parents for a flying visit to the little old house of dreams. Nan had asked Faith to go with them, but Faith had declined. She would never have admitted it, but she felt a little secret jealousy of Persis Ford, concerning whose wonderful beauty and city glamour she had heard a great deal. No, she wasn't going to go down there and play second fiddle to anybody. She and Una took their storybooks to Rainbow Valley and read, while Carl investigated bugs along the banks of the brook. and all three were happy until they suddenly realized that it was twilight, and that the Old Bailey garden was uncomfortably near by. Carl came and sat down close to the girls. They all wished they had gone home a little sooner, but nobody said anything. Great velvety purple clouds heaped up in the west and spread over the valley. There was no wind, and everything was suddenly, strangely, dreadfully still. The marsh was full of thousands of fireflies. Surely some fairy parliament was being convened that night. Altogether, Rainbow Valley was not a canny place just then. Faith looked fearfully up the valley to the Old Bailey garden. Then, if anybody's blood ever did freeze, Faith Meredith's certainly froze at that moment. The eyes of Carl and Una followed her entranced gaze, and chills began gallopading up and down their spines also. For there, under the big tamarack tree on the tumble-down, grass-grown dike of the Bailey garden, was something white, shapelessly white in the gathering gloom. The three Merediths sat and gazed as if turned to stone. It's the calf," whispered Una at last. "It's too big for the calf," whispered Faith. Her mouth and lips were so dry she could hardly articulate the words. Suddenly Carl gasped, "It's coming here!" The girls gave one last agonized glance. Yes, it was creeping down over the dike, as no calf ever did or could creep. Reason fled before sudden, overmastering panic. For the moment, every one of the trio was firmly convinced that what they saw was Henry Warren's ghost. Carl sprang to his feet and bolted blindly. With a simultaneous shriek, the girls followed him. Like mad creatures they tore up the hill, across the road, and into the manse. They had left Aunt Martha sewing in the kitchen. She was not there. They rushed to the study. It was dark and tenantless. As with one impulse, they swung around and made for Ingleside, but not across Rainbow Valley. Down the hill and through the Glen street they flew on the wings of their wild terror, Carl in the lead, Una bringing up the rear. Nobody tried to stop them, though everybody who saw them wondered what fresh devilment those manse youngsters were up to now. But at the gate of Ingleside they ran into Rosemary West, who had just been in for a moment to return some borrowed books. She saw their ghastly faces and staring eyes. She realized that their poor little souls were wrung with some awful and real fear, whatever its cause. She caught Carl with one arm and Faith with the other. Una stumbled against her and held on desperately. "Children, dear, what has happened?" she said. "What has frightened you?" "Henry Warren's ghost," answered Carl through his chattering teeth. "Henry Warren's ghost?" said amazed Rosemary, who had never heard the story. "Yes," sobbed Faith hysterically. "It's there, on the Bailey dike. We saw it, and it started to chase us." Rosemary herded the three distracted creatures to the Ingleside veranda. Gilbert and Anne were both away, having also gone to the House of Dreams, but Susan appeared in the doorway, gaunt and practical and unghostlike. "What is all this rumpus about?" she inquired. Again the children gasped out their awful tale, while Rosemary held them close to her and soothed them with wordless comfort. "Likely it was an owl," said Susan, unstirred. "An owl!" The Meredith children never had any opinion of Susan's intelligence after that. "It was bigger than 1,000,000 owls," said Carl, sobbing. Oh, how ashamed Carl was of that sobbing in after days. "And it grovelled, just as Mary said, and it was crawling down over the dike to get at us. Do owls crawl?" Rosemary looked at Susan. "They must have seen something to frighten them so." "I will go and see," said Susan coolly. "Now, children, calm yourselves. Whatever you have seen, it was not a ghost. As for poor Henry Warren, I feel sure he would be only too glad to rest quietly in his peaceful grave once he got there. No fear of him venturing back, and that you may tie to. If you can make them see reason, Miss West, I will find out the truth of the matter." Susan departed for Rainbow Valley, valiantly grasping a pitchfork, which she found leaning against the back fence, where the doctor had been working in his little hayfield. A pitchfork might not be of much use against haunts, but it was a comforting sort of weapon. There was nothing to be seen in Rainbow Valley when Susan reached it. No white visitants appeared to be lurking in the shadowy, tangled Old Bailey garden. Susan marched boldly through it and beyond it, and rapped with her pitchfork on the door of the little cottage on the other side, where Mrs. Stimson lived with her 2 daughters. Back at Ingleside, Rosemary had succeeded in calming the children. They still sobbed a little from shock, but they were beginning to feel a lurking and salutary suspicion that they had made dreadful geese of themselves. This suspicion became a certainty when Susan finally returned. "I have found out what your ghost was," she said, with a grim smile, sitting down on a rocker and fanning herself. "Old Mrs. Stimson has had a pair of factory cotton sheets bleaching in the Bailey garden for a week. She spread them on the dyke under the tamarack tree because the grass was clean and short there. This evening she went out to take them in. She had her knitting in her hands, so she flung the sheets over her shoulders by way of carrying them. And then she must have dropped one of her needles, and find it she could not, and has not yet. But she went down on her knees and crept about to hunt for it, and she was at that when she heard awful yells down in the valley, and saw the 3 children tearing up the hill past her. She thought they had been bit by something, and it gave her poor old heart such a turn that she could not move or speak, but just crouched there till they disappeared. Then she staggered back home, and they have been applying stimulants to her ever since, and her heart is in a terrible condition, and she says she will not get over this fright all summer." The Merediths sat, crimson with a shame that even Rosemary's understanding sympathy could not remove. They sneaked off home, met Jerry at the manse gate, and made remorseful confession. A session of the Good Conduct Club was arranged for next morning. "Wasn't Miss West sweet to us tonight?" whispered Faith in bed. "Yes," admitted Una. "It is such a pity it changes people so much to be made stepmothers." "I don't believe it does," said Faith loyally. End of chapter 30. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter. Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 31. Carl Does Penance. "I don't see why we should be punished at all," said Faith rather sulkily. "We didn't do anything wrong. We couldn't help being frightened, and it won't do Father any harm. It was just an accident." "You were cowards," said Jerry with judicial scorn, "and you gave way to your cowardice. That is why you should be punished. Everybody will laugh at you about this, and that is a disgrace to the family." "If you knew how awful the whole thing was," said Faith with a shiver, "you would think we had been punished enough already. I wouldn't go through it again for anything in the whole world." "I believe you'd have run yourself if you'd been there," muttered Carl. "From an old woman in a cotton sheet?" mocked Jerry. "Ho, ho, ho! It didn't look a bit like an old woman," cried Faith. "It was just a great big white thing crawling about in the grass, just as Mary Vance said Henry Warren did. It's all very fine for you to laugh, Jerry Meredith, but you'd have laughed on the other side of your mouth if you'd been there. And how are we to be punished? I don't think it's fair, but let's know what we have to do, Judge Meredith." "The way I look at it," said Jerry, frowning, "is that Carl was the most to blame. He bolted first, as I understand it. Besides, he was a boy, so he should have stood his ground to protect you girls, whatever the danger was. You know that, Carl, don't you?" "I s'pose so," growled Carl shamefacedly. "Very well. This is to be your punishment. Tonight you'll sit on Mr. Hezekiah Pollock's tombstone in the graveyard alone until 12 o'clock." Carl gave a little shudder. The graveyard was not so very far from the Old Bailey garden. It would be a trying ordeal. But Carl was anxious to wipe out his disgrace and prove that he was not a coward after all. "All right," he said sturdily. "But how'll I know when it is 12? The study windows are open, and you'll hear the clock striking. And mind that you are not to budge out of that graveyard until the last stroke. As for you girls, you've got to go without jam at supper for a week." Faith and Una looked rather blank. They were inclined to think that even Carl's comparatively short though sharp agony was lighter punishment than this long, drawn-out ordeal. A whole week of soggy bread, without the saving grace of jam? But no shirking was permitted in the club. The girls accepted their lot with such philosophy as they could summon up. That night they all went to bed at 9, except Carl, who was already keeping vigil on the tombstone. Una slipped in to bid him good night. Her tender heart was wrung with sympathy. "Oh, Carl, are you much scared?" she whispered. "Not a bit," said Carl airily. "I won't sleep a wink till after 12," said Una. "If you get lonesome, just look up at our window, and remember that I'm inside, awake and thinking about you. That will be a little company, won't it?" "I'll be all right. Don't you worry about me," said Carl. But in spite of his dauntless words, Carl was a pretty lonely boy when the lights went out in the manse. He had hoped his father would be in the study, as he so often was. He would not feel alone then. But that night Mr. Meredith had been summoned to the fishing village at the harbour mouth to see a dying man. He would not likely be back until after midnight. Carl must dree his weird alone. A Glen man went past carrying a lantern. The mysterious shadows caused by the lantern light went hurtling madly over the graveyard, like a dance of demons or witches. Then they passed, and darkness fell again. One by one the lights in the glen went out. It was a very dark night, with a cloudy sky, and a raw east wind that was cold in spite of the calendar. Far away on the horizon was the low dim lustre of the Charlottetown lights. The wind wailed and sighed in the old fir trees. Mr. Alec Davis's tall monument gleamed whitely through the gloom. The willow beside it tossed long, writhing arms spectrally. At times the gyrations of its boughs made it seem as if the monument were moving too. Carl curled himself up on the tombstone with his legs tucked under him. It wasn't precisely pleasant to hang them over the edge of the stone. Just suppose bony hands should reach up out of Mr. Pollock's grave under it and clutch him by the ankles. That had been one of Mary Vance's cheerful speculations one time when they had all been sitting there. It returned to haunt Carl now. He didn't believe those things. He didn't even really believe in Henry Warren's ghost. As for Mr. Pollock, he had been dead 60 years, so it wasn't likely he cared who sat on his tombstone now. But there is something very strange and terrible in being awake when all the rest of the world is asleep. You are alone then, with nothing but your own feeble personality to pit against the mighty principalities and powers of darkness. Carl was only 10, and the dead were all around him, and he wished, oh, he wished that the clock would strike 12. Would it never strike 12? Surely Aunt Martha must have forgotten to wind it. And then it struck 11. Only 11. He must stay yet another hour in that grim place. If only there were a few friendly stars to be seen. The darkness was so thick it seemed to press against his face. There was a sound as of stealthy passing footsteps all over the graveyard. Carl shivered, partly with prickling terror, partly with real cold. Then it began to rain, a chill, penetrating drizzle. Carl's thin little cotton blouse and shirt were soon wet through. He felt chilled to the bone. He forgot mental terrors in his physical discomfort. But he must stay there till 12. He was punishing himself, and he was on his honour. Nothing had been said about rain, but it did not make any difference. When the study clock finally struck 12, a drenched little figure crept stiffly down off Mr. Pollock's tombstone, made its way into the manse, and upstairs to bed. Carl's teeth were chattering. He thought he could never get warm again. He was warm enough when morning came. Jerry gave one startled look at his crimson face, and then rushed to call his father. Mr. Meredith came hurriedly, his own face ivory white from the pallor of his long night vigil by a deathbed. He had not got home until daylight. He bent over his little lad anxiously. "Carl, are you sick?" he said. "That tombstone over there," said Carl. "It's moving about. It's coming at me. Keep it away, please." Mr. Meredith rushed to the telephone. In 10 minutes Dr. Blythe was at the manse. Half an hour later a wire was sent to town for a trained nurse, and all the glen knew that Carl Meredith was very ill with pneumonia, and that Dr. Blythe had been seen to shake his head. Gilbert shook his head more than once in the fortnight that followed. Carl developed double pneumonia. There was one night when Mr. Meredith paced his study floor, and Faith and Una huddled in their bedroom and cried, and Jerry, wild with remorse, refused to budge from the floor of the hall outside Carl's door. Dr. Blythe and the nurse never left the bedside. They fought death gallantly until the red dawn, and they won the victory. Carl rallied and passed the crisis in safety. The news was phoned about the waiting glen, and people found out how much they really loved their minister and his children. "I haven't had one decent night's sleep since I heard the child was sick," Miss Cornelia told Anne, "and Mary Vance has cried until those queer eyes of hers look like burnt holes in a blanket. Is it true that Carl got pneumonia from staying out in the graveyard that wet night for a dare?" "No. He was staying there to punish himself for cowardice in that affair of the Warren ghost. It seems they have a club for bringing themselves up, and they punish themselves when they do wrong. Jerry told Mr. Meredith all about it." "The poor little souls," said Miss Cornelia. Carl got better rapidly, for the congregation took enough nourishing things to the manse to furnish forth a hospital. Norman Douglas drove up every evening with a dozen fresh eggs and a jar of Jersey cream. Sometimes he stayed an hour, and bellowed arguments on predestination with Mr. Meredith in the study. Oftener he drove on up to the hill that overlooked the glen. When Carl was able to go again to Rainbow Valley, they had a special feast in his honor, and the doctor came down and helped them with fireworks. Mary Vance was there too, but she did not tell any ghost stories. Miss Cornelia had given her a talking to on that subject, which Mary would not forget in a hurry. End of chapter 31. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter. Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 32. Two Stubborn People. Rosemary West, on her way home from a music lesson at Ingleside, turned aside to the hidden spring in Rainbow Valley. She had not been there all summer. The beautiful little spot had no longer any allurement for her. The spirit of her young lover never came to the tryst now, and the memories connected with John Meredith were too painful and poignant. But she had happened to glance backward up the valley, and had seen Norman Douglas vaulting as airily as a stripling over the old stone dike of the Bailey garden, and thought he was on his way up the hill. If he overtook her, she would have to walk home with him, and she was not going to do that. So she slipped at once behind the maples of the spring, hoping he had not seen her and would pass on. But Norman had seen her, and, what was more, was in pursuit of her. He had been wanting for some time to have a talk with Rosemary, but she had always, so it seemed, avoided him. Rosemary had never at any time liked Norman Douglas very well. His bluster, his temper, his noisy hilarity had always antagonized her. Long ago she had often wondered how Ellen could possibly be attracted to him. Norman Douglas was perfectly aware of her dislike, and he chuckled over it. It never worried Norman if people did not like him. It did not even make him dislike them in return, for he took it as a kind of extorted compliment. He thought Rosemary a fine girl, and he meant to be an excellent, generous brother-in-law to her. But before he could be her brother-in-law, he had to have a talk with her. So, having seen her leaving Ingleside as he stood in the doorway of a Glen store, he had straightway plunged into the valley to overtake her. Rosemary was sitting pensively on the maple seat where John Meredith had been sitting on that evening nearly a year ago. The tiny spring shimmered and dimpled under its fringe of ferns. Ruby-red gleams of sunset fell through the arching boughs. A tall clump of perfect asters grew at her side. The little spot was as dreamy and witching and evasive as any retreat of fairies and dryads in ancient forests. Into it Norman Douglas bounced, scattering and annihilating its charm in a moment. His personality seemed to swallow the place up. There was simply nothing there but Norman Douglas, big, red-bearded, complacent. "Good evening," said Rosemary coldly, standing up. "Evening, girl. Sit down again, sit down again. I want to have a talk with you. Bless the girl, what's she looking at me like that for? I don't want to eat you. I've had my supper. Sit down and be civil." "I can hear what you have to say quite as well here," said Rosemary. "So you can, girl, if you use your ears. I only wanted you to be comfortable. You look so derned uncomfortable standing there. Well, I'll sit anyway." Norman accordingly sat down in the very place John Meredith had once sat. The contrast was so ludicrous that Rosemary was afraid she would go off into a peal of hysterical laughter over it. Norman cast his hat aside, placed his huge red hands on his knees, and looked up at her with his eyes a twinkle. "Come, girl, don't be so stiff," he said ingratiatingly. When he liked, he could be very ingratiating. "Let's have a reasonable, sensible, friendly chat. There's something I want to ask you. Ellen says she won't, so it's up to me to do it." Rosemary looked down at the spring, which seemed to have shrunk to the size of a dewdrop. Norman gazed at her in despair. "Durn it all, you might help a fellow out a bit," he burst forth. "What is it you want me to help you say?" asked Rosemary scornfully. "You know as well as I do, girl. Don't be putting on your tragedy airs. No wonder Ellen was scared to ask you. Look here, girl. Ellen and I want to marry each other. That's plain English, isn't it? Got that? And Ellen says she can't unless you give her back some tomfool promise she made. Come now, will you do it? Will you do it?" "Yes," said Rosemary. Norman bounced up and seized her reluctant hand. "Good! I knew you would. I told Ellen you would. I knew it would only take a minute. Now, girl, you go home and tell Ellen, and we'll have a wedding in a fortnight, and you'll come and live with us. We shan't leave you to roost on that hilltop like a lonely crow, don't you worry. I know you hate me, but Lord, it'll be great fun living with someone that hates me. Life'll have some spice in it after this. Ellen will roast me, and you'll freeze me. I won't have a dull moment." Rosemary did not condescend to tell him that nothing would ever induce her to live in his house. She let him go striding back to the glen, oozing delight and complacency, and she walked slowly up the hill home. She had known this was coming ever since she had returned from Kingsport and found Norman Douglas established as a frequent evening caller. His name was never mentioned between her and Ellen, but the very avoidance of it was significant. It was not in Rosemary's nature to feel bitter, or she would have felt very bitter. She was coldly civil to Norman, and she made no difference in any way with Ellen. But Ellen had not found much comfort in her second courtship. She was in the garden, attended by St. George, when Rosemary came home. The two sisters met in the dahlia walk. St. George sat down on the gravel walk between them, and folded his glossy black tail gracefully around his white paws, with all the indifference of a well-fed, well-bred, well-groomed cat. "Did you ever see such dahlias?" demanded Ellen proudly. "They are just the finest we've ever had." Rosemary had never cared for dahlias. Their presence in the garden was her concession to Ellen's taste. She noticed one huge mottled one of crimson and yellow that lorded it over all the others. "That dahlia," she said, pointing to it, "is exactly like Norman Douglas. It might easily be his twin brother." Ellen's dark-browed face flushed. She admired the dahlia in question, but she knew Rosemary did not, and that no compliment was intended. But she dared not resent Rosemary's speech. Poor Ellen dared not resent anything just then. And it was the first time Rosemary had ever mentioned Norman's name to her. She felt that this portended something. "I met Norman Douglas in the valley," said Rosemary, looking straight at her sister, "and he told me you and he wanted to be married, if I would give you permission." "Yes? What did you say?" asked Ellen, trying to speak naturally and offhandedly, and failing completely. She could not meet Rosemary's eyes. She looked down at St. George's sleek back, and felt horribly afraid. Rosemary had either said she would or she wouldn't. If she would, Ellen would feel so ashamed and remorseful that she would be a very uncomfortable bride-elect, and if she wouldn't, well, Ellen had once learned to live without Norman Douglas, but she had forgotten the lesson, and felt that she could never learn it again. "I said that as far as I was concerned, you were at full liberty to marry each other as soon as you liked," said Rosemary. "Thank you," said Ellen, still looking at St. George. Rosemary's face softened. "I hope you'll be happy, Ellen," she said gently. "Oh, Rosemary!" Ellen looked up in distress. "I'm so ashamed. I don't deserve it, after all I said to you." "We won't speak about that," said Rosemary, hurriedly and decidedly. But, persisted Ellen, "you are free now, too, and it's not too late. John Meredith—" "Ellen West!" Rosemary had a little spark of temper under all her sweetness, and it flashed forth now in her blue eyes. "Have you quite lost your senses in every respect? Do you suppose for an instant that I am going to go to John Meredith and say meekly, 'Please, sir, I've changed my mind, and please, sir, I hope you haven't changed yours'? Is that what you want me to do? No, no! But a little encouragement, he would come back. Never. He despises me, and rightly. No more of this, Ellen. I bear you no grudge. Marry whom you like, but no meddling in my affairs." "Then you must come and live with me," said Ellen. "I shall not leave you here alone." "Do you really think that I would go and live in Norman Douglas's house?" "Why not?" cried Ellen, half angrily, despite her humiliation. Rosemary began to laugh. "Ellen, I thought you had a sense of humor. Can you see me doing it?" "I don't see why you wouldn't. His house is big enough. You'd have your share of it to yourself. He wouldn't interfere." "Ellen, the thing is not to be thought of. Don't bring this up again." "Then," said Ellen coldly and determinedly, "I shall not marry him. I shall not leave you here alone. That is all there is to be said about it." "Nonsense, Ellen." "It is not nonsense. It is my firm decision. It would be absurd for you to think of living here by yourself, a mile from any other house. If you won't come with me, I'll stay with you. Now we won't argue the matter, so don't try." "I shall leave Norman to do the arguing," said Rosemary. "I'll deal with Norman. I can manage him. I would never have asked you to give me back my promise, never, but I had to tell Norman why I couldn't marry him, and he said he would ask you. I couldn't prevent him. You need not suppose you are the only person in the world who possesses self-respect. I never dreamed of marrying and leaving you here alone, and you'll find I can be as determined as yourself." Rosemary turned away and went into the house, with a shrug of her shoulders. Ellen looked down at St. George, who had never blinked an eyelash or stirred a whisker during the whole interview. "St. George, this world would be a dull place without the men, I'll admit, but I'm almost tempted to wish there wasn't one of 'em in it. Look at the trouble and bother they've made right here, George. Torn our happy old life completely up by the roots, Saint. John Meredith began it, and Norman Douglas has finished it. And now both of them have to go into limbo. Norman is the only man I ever met who agrees with me that the Kaiser of Germany is the most dangerous creature alive on this earth, and I can't marry this sensible person because my sister is stubborn and I'm stubborner. Mark my words, St. George, the minister would come back if she raised her little finger, but she won't, George. She'll never do it. She won't even crook it, and I don't dare meddle, Saint. I won't sulk, George. Rosemary didn't sulk, so I'm determined I won't either, Saint. Norman will tear up the turf, but the long and short of it is, St. George, that all of us old fools must just stop thinking of marrying. Well, well, despair is a free man, hope is a slave, Saint. So now come into the house, George, and I'll solace you with a saucerful of cream. Then there will be one happy and contented creature on this hill at least." End of chapter 32. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter, Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 33. Carl is not whipped. "There is something I think I ought to tell you," said Mary Vance mysteriously. She and Faith and Una were walking arm in arm through the village, having foregathered at Mr. Flagg's store. Una and Faith exchanged looks, which said, "Now something disagreeable is coming." When Mary Vance thought she ought to tell them things, there was seldom much pleasure in the hearing. They often wondered why they kept on liking Mary Vance, for like her they did, in spite of everything. To be sure, she was generally a stimulating and agreeable companion, if only she would not have those convictions that it was her duty to tell them things. "Do you know that Rosemary West won't marry your pa because she thinks you are such a wild lot? She's afraid she couldn't bring you up right, and so she turned him down." Una's heart thrilled with secret exultation. She was very glad to hear that Miss West would not marry her father. But Faith was rather disappointed. "How do you know?" she asked. "Oh, everybody's saying it. I heard Mrs. Elliott talking it over with Mrs. Doctor. They thought I was too far away to hear, but I've got ears like a cat's. Mrs. Elliott said she hadn't a doubt that Rosemary was afraid to try stepmothering you because you'd got such a reputation. Your pa never goes up the hill now. Neither does Norman Douglas. Folks say Ellen has jilted him just to get square with him for jilting her ages ago. But Norman is going about declaring he'll get her yet. And I think you ought to know. You've spoiled your pa's match, and I think it's a pity, for he's bound to marry somebody before long, and Rosemary West would have been the best wife I know of for him." "You told me all stepmothers were cruel and wicked," said Una. "Oh, well," said Mary rather confusedly, "they're mostly awful cranky, I know. But Rosemary West couldn't be very mean to anyone. I tell you, if your pa turns round and marries Emmeline Drew, you'll wish you'd behaved yourselves better and not frightened Rosemary out of it. It's awful that you've got such a reputation that no decent woman'll marry your pa on account of you. Of course, I know that half the yarns that are told about you ain't true, but give a dog a bad name. Why, some folks are saying that it was Jerry and Carl that threw the stones through Mrs. Stimson's window the other night, when it was really them two Boyd boys. But I'm afraid it was Carl that put the eel in old Mrs. Carr's buggy, though I said at first I wouldn't believe it until I'd better proof than old Kitty Alec's word. I told Mrs. Elliott so right to her face." "What did Carl do?" cried Faith. "Well, they say... Now, mind, I'm only telling you what people say, so there's no use in your blaming me for it. that Carl and a lot of other boys were fishing eels over the bridge one evening last week. Mrs. Carr drove past in that old rattle-trap buggy of hers with the open back, and Carl he just up and threw a big eel into the back. When poor old Mrs. Carr was driving up the hill by Ingleside, that eel came squirming out between her feet. She thought it was a snake, and she just give one awful screech and stood up and jumped clean over the wheels. The horse bolted, but it went home and no damage was done. But Mrs. Carr jarred her legs most terrible, and has had nervous spasms ever since whenever she thinks of the eel. Says it was a rotten trick to play on the poor old soul. She's a decent body, if she is as queer as Dick's hatband." Faith and Una looked at each other again. This was a matter for the Good Conduct Club. They would not talk it over with Mary. "There goes your pa," said Mary, as Mr. Meredith passed them, "and never seeing us no more'n if we weren't here. Well, I'm getting so's I don't mind, but there are folks who do." Mr. Meredith had not seen them, but he was not walking along in his usual dreamy and abstracted fashion. He strode up the hill in agitation and distress. Mrs. Alec Davis had just told him the story of Carl and the eel. She had been very indignant about it. Old Mrs. Carr was her third cousin. Mr. Meredith was more than indignant. He was hurt and shocked. He had not thought Carl would do anything like this. He was not inclined to be hard on pranks of heedlessness or forgetfulness, but this was different. This had a nasty tang in it. When he reached home he found Carl on the lawn, patiently studying the habits and customs of a colony of wasps. Calling him into the study, Mr. Meredith confronted him, with a sterner face than any of his children had ever seen before, and asked him if the story were true. "Yes," said Carl, flushing, but meeting his father's eyes bravely. Mr. Meredith groaned. He had hoped that there had been at least exaggeration. "Tell me the whole matter," he said. "The boys were fishing for eels over the bridge," said Carl. "Link Drew had caught a whopper, I mean an awful big one, the biggest eel I ever saw. He caught it right at the start, and it had been lying in his basket a long time, still as still. I thought it was dead, honest I did. Then old Mrs. Carr drove over the bridge, and she called us all young varmints and told us to go home, and we hadn't said a word to her, father, truly. So when she drove back again after going to the store, the boys dared me to put Link's eel in her buggy. I thought it was so dead it couldn't hurt her, and I threw it in. Then the eel came to life on the hill, and we heard her scream and saw her jump out. I was awful sorry. That's all, father." It was not quite as bad as Mr. Meredith had feared, but it was quite bad enough. "I must punish you, Carl," he said sorrowfully. "Yes, I know, father. I must whip you." Carl winced. He had never been whipped. Then, seeing how badly his father felt, he said cheerfully, "All right, father." Mr. Meredith misunderstood his cheerfulness and thought him insensible. He told Carl to come to the study after supper, and when the boy had gone out he flung himself into his chair and groaned again. He dreaded the evening sevenfold more than Carl did. The poor minister did not even know what he should whip his boy with. What was used to whip boys? Rods? Canes? No, that would be too brutal. A timber switch, then? And he, John Meredith, must hie him to the woods and cut one. It was an abominable thought. Then a picture presented itself, unbidden, to his mind. He saw Mrs. Carr's wizened, nutcracker little face at the appearance of that reviving eel. He saw her sailing witch-like over the buggy wheels. Before he could prevent himself, the minister laughed. Then he was angry with himself, and angrier still with Carl. He would get that switch at once, and it must not be too limber after all. Carl was talking the matter over in the graveyard with Faith and Una, who had just come home. They were horrified at the idea of his being whipped, and by father, who had never done such a thing. But they agreed soberly that it was just. "You know it was a dreadful thing to do," sighed Faith. "And you never owned up in the club." "I forgot," said Carl. "Besides, I didn't think any harm came of it. I didn't know she jarred her legs. But I'm to be whipped, and that will make things square." "Will it hurt very much?" said Una, slipping her hand into Carl's. "Oh, not so much, I guess," said Carl gamely. "Anyhow, I'm not going to cry, no matter how much it hurts. It would make father feel so bad if I did. He's all cut up now. I wish I could whip myself hard enough and save him doing it." After supper, at which Carl had eaten little, and Mr. Meredith nothing at all, both went silently into the study. The switch lay on the table. Mr. Meredith had had a bad time getting a switch to suit him. He cut one, then felt it was too slender. Carl had done a really indefensible thing. Then he cut another. It was far too thick. After all, Carl had thought the eel was dead. The third one suited him better, but as he picked it up from the table, it seemed very thick and heavy, more like a stick than a switch. "Hold out your hand," he said to Carl. Carl threw back his head and held out his hand unflinchingly. But he was not very old, and he could not quite keep a little fear out of his eyes. Mr. Meredith looked down into those eyes. Why, they were Cecilia's eyes, her very eyes, and in them was the self-same expression he had once seen in Cecilia's eyes when she had come to him to tell him something she had been a little afraid to tell him. Here were her eyes in Carl's little white face, and 6 weeks ago he had thought, through one endless, terrible night, that his little lad was dying. John Meredith threw down the switch. "Go," he said. "I cannot whip you." Carl fled to the graveyard, feeling that the look on his father's face was worse than any whipping. "Is it over so soon?" asked Faith. She and Una had been holding hands and setting teeth on the Pollock tombstone. He didn't whip me at all," said Carl with a sob, "and I wish he had. And he's in there, feeling just awful." Una slipped away. Her heart yearned to comfort her father. As noiselessly as a little gray mouse, she opened the study door and crept in. The room was dark with twilight. Her father was sitting at his desk. His back was towards her. His head was in his hands. He was talking to himself, broken, anguished words. But Una heard and understood, with the sudden illumination that comes to sensitive, unmothered children. As silently as she had come in, she slipped out and closed the door. John Meredith went on talking out his pain in what he deemed his undisturbed solitude. End of chapter 33. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter. Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 34. Una visits the hill. Una went upstairs. Carl and Faith were already on their way through the early moonlight to Rainbow Valley, having heard therefrom the elfin lilt of Jerry's Jew-harp, and having guessed that the Blythes were there, and fun afoot. Una had no wish to go. She sought her own room first, where she sat down on her bed and had a little cry. She did not want anybody to come in her dear mother's place. She did not want a stepmother who would hate her and make her father hate her. But father was so desperately unhappy, and if she could do anything to make him happier, she must do it. There was only one thing she could do, and she had known the moment she had left the study that she must do it. But it was a very hard thing to do. After Una cried her heart out, she wiped her eyes and went to the spare room. It was dark and rather musty, for the blind had not been drawn up, nor the window opened for a long time. Aunt Martha was no fresh-air fiend. But as nobody ever thought of shutting a door in the manse, this did not matter so much, save when some unfortunate minister came to stay all night, and was compelled to breathe the spare-room atmosphere. There was a closet in the spare room, and far back in the closet A grey silk dress was hanging. Una went into the closet and shut the door, went down on her knees and pressed her face against the soft silken folds. It had been her mother's wedding dress. It was still full of a sweet, faint, haunting perfume, like lingering love. Una always felt very close to her mother there, as if she were kneeling at her feet, with head in her lap. She went there once in a long while, when life was too hard. "Mother," she whispered to the grey silk gown, "I will never forget you, Mother, and I'll always love you best. But I have to do it, Mother, because Father is so very unhappy. I know you wouldn't want him to be unhappy. And I will be very good to her, Mother, and try to love her, even if she is like Mary Vance said stepmothers always were." Una carried some fine spiritual strength away from her secret shrine. She slept peacefully that night, with the tear stains still glistening on her sweet, serious little face. The next afternoon she put on her best dress and hat. They were shabby enough. Every other girl in the Glen had new clothes that summer, except Faith and Una. Mary Vance had a lovely dress of white embroidered lawn, with scarlet silk sash and shoulder bows. But today Una did not mind her shabbiness. She only wanted to be very neat. She washed her face carefully. She brushed her black hair until it was as smooth as satin. She tied her shoelaces carefully, having first sewed up 2 runs in her one pair of good stockings. She would have liked to black her shoes, but she could not find any blacking. Finally she slipped away from the manse, down through Rainbow Valley, up through the Whispering Woods, and out to the road that ran past the house on the hill. It was quite a long walk, and Una was tired and warm when she got there. She saw Rosemary West sitting under a tree in the garden, and stole past the dahlia beds to her. Rosemary had a book in her lap, but she was gazing afar across the harbour, and her thoughts were sorrowful enough. Life had not been pleasant lately in the house on the hill. Ellen had not sulked. Ellen had been a brick. But things can be felt that are never said, and at times the silence between the two women was intolerably eloquent. All the many familiar things that had once made life sweet had a flavour of bitterness now. Norman Douglas made periodical irruptions also, bullying and coaxing Ellen by turns. It would end, Rosemary believed, by his dragging Ellen off with him some day, and Rosemary felt that she would be almost glad when it happened. Existence would be horribly lonely then, but it would be no longer charged with dynamite. She was roused from her unpleasant reverie by a timid little touch on her shoulder. Turning, she saw Una Meredith. "Why, Una dear, did you walk up here in all this heat?" "Yes," said Una. I came to... But she found it very hard to say what she had come to do. Her voice failed. Her eyes filled with tears. "Why, Una, little girl, what is the trouble? Don't be afraid to tell me." Rosemary put her arm around the thin little form and drew the child close to her. Her eyes were very beautiful, her touch so tender that Una found courage. "I came to ask you to marry Father," she gasped. Rosemary was silent for a moment from sheer dumbfounderment. She stared at Una blankly. "Oh, don't be angry, please, dear Miss West," said Una pleadingly. "You see, everybody is saying that you wouldn't marry Father because we are so bad. He is very unhappy about it. So I thought I would come and tell you that we are never bad on purpose. And if you will only marry Father, we will all try to be good and do just what you tell us. I'm sure you won't have any trouble with us. Please, Miss West." Rosemary had been thinking rapidly. Gossiping surmise, she saw, had put this mistaken idea into Una's mind. She must be perfectly frank and sincere with the child. "Una dear," she said softly, "it isn't because of you poor little souls that I cannot be your father's wife. I never thought of such a thing. You are not bad. I never supposed you were. There There was another reason altogether, Una." "Don't you like father?" asked Una, lifting reproachful eyes. "Oh, Miss West, you don't know how nice he is. I'm sure he'd make you a good husband." Even in the midst of her perplexity and distress, Rosemary couldn't help a twisted little smile. "Oh, don't laugh, Miss West!" Una cried passionately. "Father feels dreadful about it." "I think you're mistaken, dear," said Rosemary. "I'm not. I'm sure I'm not. Oh, Miss West, father was going to whip Carl yesterday. Carl had been naughty, and father couldn't do it because you see he had no practice in whipping. So when Carl came out and told us father felt so bad, I slipped into the study to see if I could help him. He likes me to comfort him, Miss West, and he didn't hear me come in, and I heard what he was saying. I'll tell you, Miss West, if you'll let me whisper it in your ear." Una whispered earnestly. Rosemary's face turned crimson. So John Meredith still cared. He hadn't changed his mind. And he must care intensely if he had said that. Care more than she had ever supposed he did. She sat still for a moment, stroking Una's hair. Then she said, "Will you take a little letter from me to your father, Una?" "Oh, are you going to marry him, Miss West?" asked Una eagerly. "Perhaps, if he really wants me to," said Rosemary, blushing again. I'm glad," said Una bravely. Then she looked up, with quivering lips. "Oh, Miss West, you won't turn father against us. You won't make him hate us, will you?" she said beseechingly. Rosemary stared again. "Una Meredith, do you think I would do such a thing? Whatever put such an idea into your head?" "Mary Vance said stepmothers were all like that, and that they all hated their stepchildren and made their father hate them. She said they just couldn't help it. Just being stepmothers made them like that." "You poor child. And yet you came up here and asked me to marry your father because you wanted to make him happy? You're a darling, a heroine, as Ellen would say. You're a brick. Now listen to me very closely, dearest. Mary Vance is a silly little girl who doesn't know very much, and she is dreadfully mistaken about some things. I would never dream of trying to turn your father against you. I would love you all dearly. I don't want to take your own mother's place. She must always have that in your hearts. But neither have I any intention of being a stepmother. I want to be your friend and helper and chum. Don't you think that would be nice, Una, if you and Faith and Carl and Jerry could just think of me as a good jolly chum, a big older sister?" "Oh, it would be lovely!" cried Una, with a transfigured face. She flung her arms impulsively round Rosemary's neck. She was so happy that she felt as if she could fly on wings. "Do the others, do Faith and the boys have the same idea you had about stepmothers?" "No. Faith never believed Mary Vance. I was dreadfully foolish to believe her either. Faith loves you already. She has loved you ever since poor Adam was eaten. And Jerry and Carl will think it is jolly. Oh, Miss West, when you come to live with us, could you teach me to cook a little and sew and do things? I don't know anything. I won't be much trouble. I'll try to learn fast." "Darling, I'll teach you and help you all I can. Now you won't say a word to anybody about this, will you? Not even to Faith, until your father himself tells you you may? And you'll stay and have tea with me? Oh, thank you. But I think I'd rather go right back and take the letter to father," faltered Una. "You see, he'll be so glad that much sooner, Miss West." "I see," said Rosemary. She went to the house, wrote a note, and gave it to Una. When that small damsel had run off, a palpitating bundle of happiness, Rosemary went to Ellen, who was shelling peas on the back porch. "Ellen," she said, "Una Meredith has just been here to ask me to marry her father." Ellen looked up and read her sister's face. "And you're going to?" she said. "It's quite likely." Ellen went on shelling peas for a few minutes. Then she suddenly put her hand up to her own face. There were tears in her black-browed eyes. I hope we'll all be happy," she said, between a sob and a laugh. Down at the manse, Una Meredith, warm, rosy, triumphant, marched boldly into her father's study, and laid a letter on the desk before him. His pale face flushed as he saw the clear, fine handwriting he knew so well. He opened the letter. It was very short, but he shed 20 years as he read it. Rosemary asked him if he could meet her that evening at sunset by the spring in Rainbow Valley. End of chapter 34. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter, Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 35. Let the Piper Come. "And so," said Miss Cornelia, "the double wedding is to be some time about the middle of this month." There was a faint chill in the air of the early September evening, so Anne had lighted her ever-ready fire of driftwood in the big living-room, and she and Miss Cornelia basked in its fairy flicker. "It is so delightful, especially in regard to Mr. Meredith and Rosemary," said Anne. "I'm as happy in the thought of it as I was when I was getting married myself. I felt exactly like a bride again last evening when I was up on the hill seeing Rosemary's trousseau." "They tell me her things are fine enough for a princess," said Susan from a shadowy corner where she was cuddling her brown boy. "I have been invited up to see them also, and I intend to go some evening. I understand that Rosemary is to wear white silk and a veil, but Ellen is to be married in navy blue. I have no doubt, Mrs. Dr. dear, that that is very sensible of her, but for my own part I have always felt that if I were ever married I would prefer the white and the veil, as being more bride-like." A vision of Susan in white and a veil presented itself before Anne's inner vision, and was almost too much for her. "As for Mr. Meredith," said Miss Cornelia, "even his engagement has made a different man of him. He isn't half so dreamy and absent-minded, believe me. I was so relieved when I heard that he had decided to close the manse, and let the children visit round while he was away on his honeymoon. If he had left them and old Aunt Martha there alone for a month, I should have expected to wake every morning and see the place burned down." "Aunt Martha and Jerry are coming here," said Anne. "Carl is going to Elder Clow's. I haven't heard where the girls are going." "Oh, I'm going to take them," said Miss Cornelia. "Of course I was glad to, but Mary wouldn't have given me no peace till I asked them anyway. The Ladies' Aid is going to clean the manse from top to bottom before the bride and groom come back, and Norman Douglas has arranged to fill the cellar with vegetables. Nobody ever saw or heard anything quite like Norman Douglas these days, believe me. He's so tickled that he's going to marry Ellen West after wanting her all his life. If I was Ellen, but then I'm not, and if she is satisfied, I can very well be. I heard her say years ago when she was a schoolgirl that she didn't want a tame puppy for a husband. There's nothing tame about Norman, believe me." The sun was setting over Rainbow Valley. The pond was wearing a wonderful tissue of purple and gold and green and crimson. A faint blue haze rested on the eastern hill, over which a great pale round moon was just floating up like a silver bubble. They were all there, squatted in the little open glade: Faith and Una, Jerry and Carl, Jem and Walter, Nan and Di, and Mary Vance. They had been having a special celebration, for it would be Jem's last evening in Rainbow Valley. On the morrow he would leave for Charlottetown to attend Queen's Academy. Their charmed circle would be broken, and in spite of the jollity of their little festival, there was a hint of sorrow in every gay young heart. "See, there is a great golden palace over there in the sunset," said Walter, pointing. "Look at the shining towers, and the crimson banners streaming from them. Perhaps a conqueror is riding home from battle, and they are hanging them out to do honor to him. Oh, I wish we had the old days back again. exclaimed Jem. "I'd love to be a soldier, a great triumphant general. I'd give everything to see a big battle." Well, Jem was to be a soldier, and see a greater battle than had ever been fought in the world, but that was as yet far in the future; and the mother, whose first-born son he was wont to look on her boys, and thank God that the brave days of old, which Jem longed for, were gone forever, and that never would it be necessary for the sons of Canada to ride forth to battle, for the ashes of their fathers and the temples of their gods. The shadow of the great conflict had not yet made felt any forerunner of its chill. The lads who were to fight, and perhaps fall, on the fields of France and Flanders, Gallipoli and Palestine, were still roguish schoolboys, with a fair life in prospect before them. The girls whose hearts were to be wrung were yet fair little maidens, astar with hopes and dreams. Slowly the banners of the Sunset City gave up their crimson and gold. Slowly the conqueror's pageant faded out. Twilight crept over the valley, and the little group grew silent. Walter had been reading again that day in his beloved book of myths, and he remembered how he had once fancied the Pied Piper coming down the valley on an evening just like this. He began to speak dreamily, partly because he wanted to thrill his companions a little, partly because something apart from him seemed to be speaking through his lips. "The Piper is coming nearer," he said. "He is nearer than he was that evening I saw him before. His long shadowy cloak is blowing around him. He pipes, and we must follow. Jem and Carl and Jerry and I, round and round the world. Listen, listen! Can't you hear his wild music?" The girls shivered. "You know you're only pretending," protested Mary Vance, "and I wish you wouldn't. You make it too real. I hate that old Piper of yours." But Jem sprang up with a gay laugh. He stood up on a little hillock, tall and splendid, with his open brow and his fearless eyes. There were thousands like him all over the land of the maple. "Let the Piper come, and welcome," he cried, waving his hand. "I'll follow him gladly, round and round the world." End of Chapter 35. End of Rainbow Valley.